introduction to Real Facebook Oversight Board's experiment, really, in what happens when you turn to a U.S. Senate hearing and talk about it in real time with experts. And of course, we're talking about the Facebook, Google, and Twitter execs testifying on social media regulations with the U.S. Senate Commerce Committee. We'll be joined in about 10 minutes by Roger McNamee, but I'm already joined by Shoshana Zuboff. Shoshana, did you want to tell us a bit about Section 230 before we get really into it?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Good to see you, so to speak. So, look, Section 230. What's important to know about Section 230 is that it came into existence in order to allow the internet company to actually moderate its content without having liability. Before Section 230, there were two court cases. One of them, a court decided that if you moderate, then you're liable for what's up there. And in another one, the court decided that if you moderate, you're not liable for what's up there. So there were these conflicting court cases, and Section 230 came in to say, look, we need internet companies to be good Samaritans. We need them to block content that is just really bad and gross and inappropriate or violent or, most importantly, counterfactual. In other words, lies. So this was to empower the companies to do the right thing without being held liable. And what that meant was they were not going to be held as the publishers of the content. So they wouldn't be liable for the content, but they could move in and they could shape it according to proper standards. So back in the 90s, back in the mid to late 90s, when this got going, this seemed like a reasonable thing to do. What the Section 230 did not anticipate was surveillance capitalism. Whoops. Surveillance capitalism comes on board a few years later, and it changes the whole game. Why? Because Section 230 is a choice between, are you a distributor or are you a publisher? Be a distributor, but be a nice person. That was the idea.
Good actor.
Good actor, good Samaritan. Once you get to surveillance capitalism, you've got a third choice. You're not a publisher. You're not a distributor. You're an extractor. This changes everything, because now all of the financial incentives in a company like Facebook or Google, all of the financial incentives are to just drive as much content through those pipes on the way to AI manufacturing as possible. So all of the incentives are against doing any kind of moderation. You want to extract the maximum. And so you want the maximum amount of content. That's why Facebook executives say, our business is connection. Maybe you connect to launch a terrorist attack. Maybe you connect to fall in love and get married. We don't care. We're just about connection. That's what I call radical indifference. This changed the whole game. So now what we're trying to do as extractors is we only have two reasons to intervene for content moderation, only two. One is because we're really turning off users and we risk disengagement. That's number one. The only other reason is because regulators are getting mad at us and they might make some laws that shift the whole game from self-regulation to actually having to follow a law. That's where we are now, folks, and that's the debate. And everything that you hear the executives saying today is going to be geared toward how do we keep the maximum freedom to do the maximum extraction while still not antagonizing these lawmakers who might slap regulations on us that would impede extraction. That is the thing that they want to avoid at all costs. Get me?
So their whole job is to make it look like they're doing enough so that nobody feels the need to thrust laws and regulations upon them.
So the minimum regulation, right? So they can look like they're being good Samaritans without in
Mm,
any way materially threatening their data flows, their supply chains of data, which they always want to be full. And of course, what we've learned about extraction is that that means that algorithms end up driving people toward content which produces maximum engagement and therefore maximum extraction. That means the hate, the lies, the violence, all the crazy things that are making us insane and destroying our democracy, those get the maximum engagement and therefore more extraction. That's the problem that we're facing.
And we've heard briefly. I think we're just still just waiting for them to arrive from the chair. He focused his entire open remarks pretty much on the idea of silencing conservative voices on social media as a central theme. Do you think that we can expect anything else from the Republican side, or do you think this will be the primary narrative that they're pursuing?
Well, look, I'm so glad you raised that because, Kyle, when you think about it, the fact that this committee is meeting, the fact that Section 230, has been popped up to the top of the queue here, it's actually surreal because this all got started because Mr. Trump, back in, I think it was May 20th of the spring, Mr. Trump posts a tweet, and the tweet is full of lies, false statements about the reliability of mail-in voting. And Twitter decides
Mm,
to come on in here with an alert and say, "Hey, folks, this is not true. This is not a sound statement. So beware." Mr. Trump was outraged that he would not have free reign to lie in social media. And he decided that he was going to retaliate by telling Congress that it had to revoke Section 230 as a
mm,
punishment to the tech companies. But the surreal piece of this is that it's only Section 230 that allows Mr. Trump and all of the Trump emulators and lookalikes and all of the oceans of disinformation and misinformation that have followed from his influence. It's only Section 230 that allows them to exist in social media in the first
in the
place.
first place. Of course.
Section 230 is what gave him life, and because he is irrational and vindictive, he's simply looking for some kind of retaliatory response, which is strangely against his own narrow interests as a liar on social media. And so here we are in Congress in hearings.
Yeah. Do you have any sense of what you think the Democrats will be focusing on? If they'll be leaning in and trying to disprove the Republican theory. Will they be following their own narrative?
Well, I hope that the Democrats will be leaning in on disinformation, misinformation. Why is it that here in the year 2020, 4 years later, after everything we learned from the last election in 2016, why is it that we are still fighting a tsunami of disinformation and misinformation on Facebook? When it knew the problem, it understood the problem, it has had 4 years to put in the brake systems that would protect our democracy from this problem, and it has failed to do so.
Hmm.
So this is an opportunity for the Democrats to lean in on the most important questions of this election. Why are we drowning in lies and misinformation about mail-in voting and balloting? Why are we drowning in disinformation that is aimed at voter suppression? Why are we
has
still the
involved
target of
technical debt
foreign
because the large
interference
revenue
as
has
well
been
as
made
these
the transition to a
domestic
digital
groups
age.
that
So
want to suppress
somehow we have to come
voting
together to
all
show
across our
that the
country?
diversity of voices
So
that local news
this is
represents
their
need to be
opportunity to
dealt
lean
with
in
in
on that
order to
and lean
harness
in
the
hard
advertising
and
market,
hold
and that too much
Facebook to
control in the
account,
advertising
hold
market
Mr. Zuckerberg
puts
to
a foot
account.
on the
Because
on
again,
their
everybody
ability
listening
to
should know
continue
that when
to
you're talking
evolve
about
and grow in
Facebook,
the digital
you're
age.
basically
Just
talking
as
about a
other forms of
situation
media
where
have made the
because he
transition
controls
and
all the super
still
voting
making the
shares,
transition, we
and
want
because there
all the
has
virile
been virtually
dynamic
no
news media
law
across the
to
United
impede
States of
him in any
America.
way
So I plan to ask
since
the
his
witnesses
company got
today about
started back
that.
around
I wish we
2010,
had time to go into depth
we've
on
created a
privacy and
situation
privacy issues,
in
but
our
Mr. Chairman,
country and
you
in our
know, and
world
so does
where this
Senator
one
Wood
young
and your
man
colleagues of the
has
Committee on
control,
Oversight, how
absolute
important it
control,
is that we
over the
protect our
most
consumers on
consequential
privacy issues.
system
And we're
of
not
global
done with this yet.
communications that has
There
ever
is much
existed.
to do to bring your
Mm,
This is a
voices in the
bizarre,
United
talk about
States on this
surreal. This is
important
a
issue.
bizarre,
And I hope that as we will
intolerable
have time or in the
situation.
follow-up to these
And it is my
questions,
hope that
that
the
we can
Democrats,
ask our witnesses
over
about
the
that
next 4
today.
years,
But
please
make no
God,
mistake,
with a
gentlemen,
successful
thank you for
election
joining us.
next
But
Tuesday,
this is
um,
probably one of many,
change
many, many
this once and for
conversations that
all,
we will have about
irrevocably.
all of these issues.
And this
But again,
conversation
let's
this
harness the
morning, today,
information age as
is
you are
is
doing,
certainly an
but let's also
opportunity
make
for
sure
them to
that
start
consumers are fairly
signaling
treated and
that
that we
this
are
situation
making
is
it work for
intolerable.
all of us to guarantee our
thanks so much,
privacy,
Shoshana.
our
We're
diversity of
we're joined by
voices, and
Roger
upholding
McNamee
our democratic
right now.
principles.
Roger,
And
perfect
the fact
timing. I was
that
just
we,
about to
the
quote
United
you.
States of America,
We're just
stand for
before the
freedom
hearing
of
really gets going. We're just
information
talking
and
about
freedom of the
objectives of
press.
Republicans
Thank you.
versus Democrats and what
Thank you,
Shoshana's
Senator
hoping to
Cantwell, and
hear from
certainly
this.
you're correct.
Um,
This will not be the
and
last
I was just going to say
hearing
that she was talking about the
over this
scale of
subject matter, and I
Mark Zuckerberg's
also
power, and you
appreciate
used the
you mentioning
analogy that
concerns
he
we have
views
here
himself. He has twice as
about
many
local
monthly users as the
journalism.
population of China, and he views
At this
himself
point,
as a sovereign nation. And that for me has
about
always
to
really
receive
helped me
testimony from our
understand the
witnesses.
scale of
Before we
Facebook.
begin that,
Do you want to
let
just
me
give a
remind
quick
members
introduction
that
before we start
today's
listening into
hearing will
the
provide
hearing?
senators with
I
7
believe that
minutes
Good
the
morning,
issue
Roger.
for good
to
morning,
present
Shoshana. It's so
We have to
lovely to
stop
see
meeting like
you.
this.
beyond the usual
Actually, I
45
like to
minutes
do this. This
that
is,
we
I think when
have
people get
done in the
physically
past.
close to me, bad
At
things
7
happen.
minutes, the
Zoom
government
is
will
exactly the right
um,
distance. So
No.
I
produce
think the issue,
a
the
pre-set
timing of
budget,
this
7
hearing
minutes,
is
and then vote
obviously
remains.
incredibly
Even
awkward because
so,
it
this
maximizes
hearing
the
could last
the
some 3 hours and
temptation
42
to
minutes
go
at that
score
rate.
political
So
points as opposed to actually going after
this will be an
substance.
extensive
But to me, the
and lengthy
fundamental
hearing.
shift that's
Members are
taken
advised that we
place
will
over
hear
the past,
mostly.
call it
Is that
2 months,
Ms.
is
Flynn? And also, shortly
the
before noon, at the
impact
request
of
of one of our
COVID
witnesses, we
disinformation
will take a short
on
10-minute
life in
break.
America,
With
the
that,
impact of
we
the
welcome our panel of
mainstreaming of
witnesses. Thank you for
QAnon,
their
particularly
testimony and
by
ask them
Facebook,
to give
and
their
that
opening
those
statements,
things have
summarizing them in some 5
essentially
minutes.
brought
The entire
politicians
statement will
into
be
this
added
conversation,
at this
not in
point
a passive
in the
way, but
record,
in an
and we
active
will
way. And the
begin
result is
with
that,
Mr. Jack
to my
Dorsey
mind,
of Twitter.
irrespective of who
Sir,
wins the election next week,
hearing
there is
you hear
going to be
us, and
regulation of tech
we have
platforms.
content
I think
warning.
it matters a lot who gets elected
Yes,
for
can you hear
what the
me?
direction of
Yes,
that and
yes.
the
So
extent of
thank you for
that will
being with
be.
us, and you're
But
now
that the
ready for Mr.
notion
Zuckerberg,
that
sir.
the game going forward will be
Thank you,
different,
members of the
I
governing
think
body,
is
for the
now a
opportunity to
near
speak with the
certainty.
American
And
people
what we just,
about Twitter
what
and
we're
Section
really
230.
focused on, at least what I hope will
My
be
remarks will be
focused on,
brief,
is
to the point,
trying
no
to find a
questions.
path to
Section
doing this
230 is the most
that
important law
actually
in
addresses the
protecting internet
problems,
speech.
point
When
one,
removed from
and then
Section
two,
230, we will
leaves
protect
us with a
speech for all
foundation
Canadians.
for good economic
Section
growth
230
with
gave internet
what
services
follows these
two
companies,
important tools.
because
Mm,
the future can
First,
be incredibly
anonymity and
bright
reliability of a
if we
user's content.
can, in fact,
Second,
reduce the role of
transparency
monopoly
protections for
in the
content
United
moderation
States
and review.
economy and
Open
restore
and
democracy,
unconditionally
because
protected
monopoly is
speech,
very much an
as long as it is
authoritarian
done
business
in
model.
good faith.
And it would be
The
really nice
concept
if we
of
could get
good faith
back
is what's
to
being challenged every day in this
democracy and
debate.
true capitalism,
Some of
where
you don't trust where I
small
believe.
companies are allowed to compete
That's
with
the
each other.
problem I
There's
want to
free
focus and
entry and
solve.
exit from markets,
How
and
do services
that
like Twitter build
consumers both
trust?
have more choice,
How do we
and
ensure more
the
choice is
economy is
required
just
if we don't?
substantially more balanced than
There
it
are
is
three
right now.
solutions
Kyle, could we go
Thanks,
to
Roger. I think we're
the
going to
hearing,
go
if that's
to.
okay?
Oh, yep. Sorry. Yeah, I think we're going to go to Jack Dorsey's giving his opening statement.
Yes, please.
They could be expansions to Section 230, new legislative frameworks, or a commitment to industry-wide self-regulation best practices. The first is requiring a services moderation process to be published. How are cases reported and reviewed? How are decisions made? What tools are used to enforce? Publishing answers to questions like these will make our process more robust and accountable to the people we serve. The second is requiring a straightforward process to appeal decisions made by humans or by algorithms. This ensures people can let us know when we don't get it right so that we can fix any mistakes and make our processes better in the future. And finally, much of the content people see today is determined by algorithms, with very little visibility into how they choose what they show. We took a first step in making this more transparent by building a button to turn off our home timeline algorithms. It's a good start, but we're inspired by the market approach suggested by Dr. Stephen Wolfram before this committee in June 2019. Enabling people to choose algorithms created by third parties to rank and filter their content is an incredibly energizing idea that's in reach. Requiring 1, moderation process and practices to be published, 2, a straightforward process to appeal decisions, and 3, best efforts around algorithmic choice are suggestions to address the concerns we all have going forward. And they're all achievable in short order. It's critical as we consider these solutions, we optimize for new startups and independent developers. Doing so ensures a level playing field that increases the probability of competing ideas to help solve problems. We mustn't entrench the largest companies any further. Thank you for the time, and I look forward to a productive discussion to dig into these and other ideas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dorsey. We now call on Mr. Sundar Pichai. You are recognized for 5 minutes, sir.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. The internet has been a powerful force for good over the past 3 decades. It has radically improved access to information, whether it's connecting Americans to jobs, getting critical updates to people in times of crisis, or helping a parent find answers to questions like, how can I get my baby to sleep through the night? At the same time, people everywhere can use their voices to share new perspectives, express themselves, and reach broader audiences than ever before. Whether you're a barber in Mississippi or a home renovator in Indiana, you can share a video and build a global fan base and a successful business right from your living room. In this way, the internet has been one of the world's most important equalizers. Information can be shared and knowledge can flow from anyone to anywhere. The same low barriers to entry also make it possible for bad actors to cause harm. As a company whose mission is to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful, Google is deeply conscious of both the opportunities and risks the internet creates. I'm proud that Google's information services like search, Gmail, Maps, and Photos provide thousands of dollars a year in value to the average American for free. We feel a deep responsibility to keep the people who use our products safe and secure, and have long invested in innovative tools to prevent abuse of our services. When it comes to privacy, we are committed to keeping your information safe, treating it responsibly, and putting you in control. We continue to make privacy improvements, like the changes I announced earlier this year to keep less data by default, and support the creation of comprehensive federal privacy laws. We are equally committed to protecting the quality and integrity of information on our platforms and supporting our democracy in a nonpartisan way. As just one timely example, our information panels on Google and YouTube inform users about where to vote and how to register. We've also taken many steps to raise up high-quality journalism, from sending 24 billion visits to news websites globally every month, to our recent $1 billion investment in partnerships with news publishers. Since our founding, we've been deeply committed to the freedom of expression. We also feel a responsibility to protect people who use our products from harmful content and to be transparent about how we do that. That's why we set and publicly disclose clear guidelines for our products and platforms, which we enforce impartially. We recognize that people come to our services with a broad spectrum of perspectives, and we are dedicated to building products that are helpful to users of all backgrounds and viewpoints. Let me be clear, we approach our work without political bias, full stop. To do otherwise would be contrary to both our business interests and our mission, which compels us to make information accessible to every type of person, no matter where they live or what they believe. Of course, our ability to provide access to a wide range of information is only possible because of existing legal frameworks like Section 230. The United States adopted Section 230 early in the Internet's history, and it has been foundational to US leadership in the tech sector. It protects the freedom to create and share content while supporting the ability of platforms and services of all sizes to responsibly address harmful content. We appreciate that this committee has put great thought into how platforms should address content. We look forward to having these conversations. As you think about how to shape policy in this important area, I would urge the committee to be very thoughtful about any changes to Section 230 and to be very aware of the consequences those changes might have on businesses and customers. At the end of the day, we all share the same goal: free access to information for everyone and responsible protections for people and their data. We support legal frameworks that achieve these goals. I look forward to engaging with you today about these important issues and answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pakai. Members should be advised at this point that we are unable to make contact with Mr. Mark Zuckerberg.
What?
We are told by Facebook staff that he is alone and attempting to connect with this hearing, and that they are requesting a 5-minute recess at this point to see if that connection can be made. I think this is
Excellent.
a most interesting development, but we're going to accommodate the request of the Facebook employees and see if within 5 minutes we can make contact and proceed. So at this point, declare a 5-minute recess.
Okay.
That's so perfect.
I think that word surreal is going to be echoing throughout the day.
Yes, agreed. There were two things I wanted to ask you about just from the last remarks. One was the remark that the internet is a great equalizer when we see the monopoly nature of it, and also that there are low barriers to entry. I just thought it was interesting when you look at the market share of these three companies in their respective spaces. I wonder if either of you had thoughts on that. And
Yeah, this is Shoshana. I'm going to let her answer this.
Well, you know, there's so many layers of fog to peel away in these kinds of statements. Is it true that we have access to information that we didn't have access to before? Yes, absolutely. And is that a great thing? Yes, absolutely. The problem is that all of those modes, all of the channels, everything we do to access that information, which is so useful and important in our lives, all of those march us through Google's, Facebook, surveillance capitalism's supply chains. So while, yes, I'm getting access to all of this information that used to be proprietary, you know, it only belonged to the doctors or the lawyers or this institution or that institution. What's also happening simultaneously is that the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Microsofts, et cetera, all of the apps, all of the surveillance capitalists throughout now the economy, beyond the tech sector, they are getting access to me and to you and to billions of other people. So
Shoshana,
what
I
we're
might just, sorry, they're coming back. I just wanted to,
okay, go ahead.
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
Can hear you
oh, there we
fine,
go.
and you're
He's
now
on
welcome
audio
There we go.
only.
5 minutes to summarize your testimony. Welcome.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. I was able to hear the other opening statements. I was just having a hard time connecting myself. All right. So
I know the feeling, Mr. Zuckerberg.
Chairman Wicker, Ranking Member Cantwell, and members of the committee, every day, millions of Americans use the internet to share their experiences and discuss issues that matter to them. Setting the rules for online discourse is an important challenge for our society, and there are principles at stake that go beyond any one platform. How do we balance free expression and safety? How do we define what is dangerous? Who should decide? I don't believe that private companies should be making so many decisions about these issues by themselves. And at Facebook, we often have to balance competing equities. Sometimes the best approach from a safety or security perspective isn't the best for privacy or free expression. So we work with experts across society to strike the right balance. We don't always get it right, but we try to be fair and consistent. The reality is that people have very different ideas and views about where the lines should be. Democrats often say that we don't remove enough content, and Republicans often say we remove too much. I expect that we'll hear some of those criticisms today. And the fact that both sides criticize us doesn't mean that we're getting this right. But it does mean that there are real disagreements about where the limits of online speech should be. And I think that's understandable. People can reasonably disagree about where to draw the lines. That's a hallmark of democratic societies, especially here in the US with our strong First Amendment tradition. But it strengthens my belief that when a private company is making these calls, we need a more accountable process that people feel is legitimate and that gives platforms certainty. At Facebook, we publish our standards and issue quarterly reports on the content that we take down. We launched an independent oversight board that can overturn our decisions, and we've committed to an audit of our content reports. But I believe Congress has a role to play too in order to give people confidence that the process is carried out in a way that balances society's deeply held values appropriately, and that's why I've called for regulation. Right now, the discussion is focused on Section 230. Some say that ending 230 would solve all of the internet's problems. Others say that it would end the internet as we know it. From our perspective, Section 230 does two basic things. First, it encourages free expression, which is fundamentally important. Without 230, platforms could potentially be held liable for everything that people say. They'd face much greater pressure to take down more content to avoid legal risk. Second, it allows platforms to moderate content. Without 230, platforms could face liability for basic moderation, like removing harassment that impacts the safety of their communities. Now, there's a reason why America leads in technology. Section 230 helped create the internet as we know it. It has helped new ideas get built and our companies to spread American values around the world, and we should maintain this advantage. But the internet has also evolved, and I think that Congress should update the law to make sure that it's working as intended. One important place to start would be making content moderation systems more transparent. Another would be to separate good actors from bad actors by making sure that companies can't hide behind Section 230 to avoid responsibility for intentionally facilitating illegal activity on their platforms. We're open to working with Congress on these ideas and more. I hope the changes that you make will ring true to the spirit and intent of 230. There are consequential choices to make here, and it's important that we don't prevent the next generation of ideas from being built. Now, although this hearing is about content policy, I also want to cover our election preparedness work. Voting ends in 6 days. We're in the midst of a pandemic, and there are ongoing threats to the integrity of this election. Since 2016, Facebook has made major investments to stop foreign interference. We've hired more than 35,000 people to work on safety and security. We've disrupted more than 100 networks coming from Russia, Iran, and China, and more that were misleading people about who they are and what they're doing, including 3 just this week.
This is an extraordinary election, and we've updated our policies to reflect that. We're showing people reliable information about voting and results, and we've strengthened our ads and misinformation policies. We're also running the largest voting information campaign in US history. We estimate that we've helped more than 4.4 million people register to vote, and 100,000 people volunteer to be poll workers. Candidates on both sides continue to use our platforms to reach voters. Now, people are rightly focused on the role that technology companies play in our elections. I'm proud of the work that we've done to support our democracy. This is a difficult period, but I believe that America will emerge stronger than ever, and we're focused on doing our part to help.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Zuckerberg, and thanks to all of our witnesses. We will now, I think we're supposed to set the clock to 7 minutes, and I see 5 minutes up there, but somehow we'll keep time, so there we are. Okay. Well, thank you all. Let me start then with Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, the committee has compiled dozens and dozens of examples of conservative content being censored and suppressed by your platforms over the last 4 years. I entered these examples into the record on October 1st when the committee voted unanimously to issue the subpoenas. And thank you all three again for working with us on the scheduling, alleviating the necessity for actually exercising the subpoenas. Mr. Dorsey, your platform allows foreign dictators to post propaganda, typically without restriction, yet you routinely restrict the President of the United States. And here's an example. In March, a spokesman for the Chinese Communist Party falsely accused the U.S. military of causing the coronavirus epidemic. He tweeted, quote, "CDC was caught on the spot. When did patient zero begin in the U.S.? How many people are infected? What are the names of the hospitals? It might be the U.S. Army who brought..."
Yeah, I think we'll just, if we can turn the live stream down a touch, we don't need to repeat Republican disinformation, and instead just maybe talk about Mark Zuckerberg's opening remarks, if either of you wanted to give a reaction to start us off.
Well, Shoshana got so rudely interrupted before, I'd like to give her a chance to continue.
Well, talk about, Mark, tell us about your reaction to his opening remarks, and then I'll chime in.
Okay, so the thing about Mark is he's really learned how to play politics. If we think back to his first appearance in 2018, when he was so incredibly awkward, but Mark is very, very smart. I was lucky enough to spend 3 years when he was 22 years old to 25, helping him on the company. And he's a really, really, really smart person and very hard worker. The problem is he has a completely different worldview. His idea of how the world should operate is incompatible with democracy. His value system is inherently authoritarian, and everything that he says reflects that. So what he's looking to do in that opening statement is to frame the problem in black and white terms that essentially favor the existing business model he has and push responsibility for any kind of remediation of harm onto government, which gives him the ability to essentially negotiate his way through problems or to simply wait them out. And we should be very careful when Mark talks about accepting numbers. For example, they talk about 4.4 million people that they registered to vote. There's actually no way to know how many people registered to vote because of Facebook, because they merely encouraged people. They did not close the entire loop, so they don't know what the number is. And, I find that number to be extremely unlikely, but, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the damage that Facebook has done by essentially pushing a couple of million people into a QAnon and mainstreaming that that essentially that conspiracy, but also the way they've amplified COVID denial in ways that have essentially amplified the message of the president at the expense of public health. You know, that's what this hearing should really be about, because if you think about engineering in every other discipline, whether you're building a building or making a pharmaceutical or working with chemicals, you have accountability. You have a responsibility to not hurt people and an actual responsibility for remediating problems and paying the cost of damage that you produce. And that's just not true in this field. And that's what Section 230 is really standing in the way of. I happen to be in favor of retaining 230, but modifying it to address the flawed business model that's currently being used by these three companies, namely the use of algorithms to amplify extreme content in order to engage the attention of the audience.
In order to drive data flows.
Exactly. Well, no, that's sorry. I was trying to give you a handoff here.
How often can we say that? So I agree with everything that Roger said, and I would just pull back the veil on a couple more points. The reason that Mark is saying we registered all of these people to vote is because 2 years ago, Facebook hired a prominent civil rights attorney, a leader in the legal community and civil rights, to head up an audit of Facebook with respect to its civil rights practices. And this audit was published, a couple of months ago now?
Yeah.
And the audit was, I don't know how to characterize it other than to say, a cri de coeur. It was an extraordinary document that revealed the systematic failures of Facebook on every dimension of civil rights. And most importantly, Mr. Zuckerberg's refusal to adopt the basic policies that would stop this wave of voter suppression, misinformation, and disinformation, of COVID misinformation and disinformation, of fraudulent messaging and information corruption completely surrounding the election process, including the validity of mail-in votes. He refused to stop any of it. But in response to this criticism from his own auditor, which was just a wholesale indictment of Zuckerberg and his company, in response to that, he said, oh, we're going to set up this nice voter registration page, and it's going to have, fact-based content on it, and people can come there, and it will give them help to register. He did that as a sop, as a window washing, as a fig leaf on the face of this catastrophic record of failing to do the minimum that company has to do in order to keep our democracy and our election on an even keel. So that's, of course, is what I'm bringing up here, not the reality behind it.
Well, and this week, they had another just terrifying example where at New York University, there is a lab that studies the ads that people see on social media. And this is something that is done transparently. It's a piece of academic research just to see what's going on in the environment on Facebook and other platforms. And of course,
sorry,
Facebook
Roger,
shut it down.
They're gonna question Mark again. I'm so sorry. I'm gonna be the one cutting you off. But
It's
please
quite
go
all right.
ahead.
This is Mystery Science Theater. We're ready for it.
Yeah. All right. Let's go to the stream.
Governor Whitmer. The individuals in that case apparently used Facebook for a broad recruiting effort. But then they actually plan the specifics of that operation off of your platform. My question is, when users reach the level of radicalization that violates your community standards, you often will ban those groups and you then drive them off to other platforms. Those platforms tend to have less transparency and oversight. But the issue that I'd like you to address is for those individuals that remain on your platform, they are often far down the path of radicalization, but they are definitely looking for an outlet. And I understand that Facebook has recently adopted a strategy to redirect users who are searching, for example, for election misinformation. But it doesn't seem that that policy applies to budding violent extremists. Mr. Zuckerberg, do you believe that the platform your platform has a responsibility to off-ramp users who are on the path to radicalization by violent extremist groups?
Senator, thanks for the question. I think this is very important. And my understanding is that we actually do a little of what you're talking about here. If people are searching for, I think, for example, white supremacist organizations, of which we ban those, we treat them as terrorist organizations. Not only are we not going to show that content, but I think we try to, where we can, highlight information that would be helpful, and I think we try to work with experts on that. I can follow up and get you more information on the scope of those activities and when we invoke that. But I certainly agree with the spirit of the question that this is a good idea and something that we should continue pursuing and perhaps expand.
Well, I appreciate those comments. I'm the ranking member on Senate Homeland Security Committee, and what we're seeing is a rise of violent extremist groups, which is very troubling. And certainly we need to work very closely with you as to how do we disrupt this kind of radicalization, especially folks that are using your platform. So I appreciate the opportunity to work further. And as we talked about last night, you asserted that Facebook is proactively working with law enforcement now to disrupt some of these real-world violent attempts that stem from some of that activity that originated your platform. Could you tell me specifically how many threats that you have proactively referred to local or state law enforcement prior to being approached for a preservation request?
Senator, I don't know the number off the top of my head, so I can follow up with you on that. But it is increasingly common that our systems are able to detect when there's potential issues. And over the last 4 years in particular, we've built closer partnerships with law enforcement and the intelligence community to be able to share those kind of signals. So we're doing more of that, including in the case that you mentioned before around the attempted kidnapping of Governor Whitmer. We identified that as a signal to the FBI. I think it was about 6 months ago when we started seeing some suspicious activity on our platform, and there's certainly that's part of our routine and how we operate.
Well, Mr. Zuckerberg, discovery tools and recommendation algorithms that your platforms use does serve up potentially extremist content based on the user profiles of folks. As we seek to understand why membership in these extremist groups is rising, I would hope that your companies are right now engaging in some forensic analysis of membership once you take down an extremist group to take a look at how that happened on your platform. It's certainly going to better inform us as to how we can disrupt this type of recruitment into extremist groups. My question for you, though, is that in 2016, you said, and this was apparently an internal Facebook internal document that was reported by the Wall Street Journal, that said that 64% of members of violent groups became members because of your platform's recommendation. And I'll quote from that report that was reported in the Wall Street Journal. It said, "Our recommendation systems grow the problem." That's clearly very concerning. And I know in response to that report in 2016, you had made changes to your policies. You made changes to some of the algorithms that existed at that time. My question is, have you seen a reduction in your platform's facilitation of extremist group recruitment since those policies were changed?
Senator, I'm not familiar with that specific study, but I agree with the concern. And making sure that our recommendation systems for what groups people are given the opportunity to join is certainly one important vector for addressing this issue. And we've taken a number of steps here, including disqualifying groups from being included in our recommendation system at all if they routinely are being used to share misinformation, or if they have content violations, or a number of other criteria. So I'm quite focused on this. I agree with where you're going with that question. I don't have any data today on the real world impact of that yet, but I think that addressing this upstream is very important.
So I appreciate you agreeing with that and that we need more data. Is it that you don't have the data just at the top of your head, or that it doesn't exist?
Well, Senator, certainly the former, and potentially the latter as well. I think it probably takes some time after we make these changes to be able to measure the impact of it. And I'm not aware of what studies are going on into this. This seems like the type of thing that one would want not just internal Facebook researchers to work on, but also potentially a collaboration with independent academics as well.
Thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, and thank you,
Thank you.
Senator Peters. Senator Gardner has also asked to go out of order, and Senator Thune has graciously deferred to him. So, Senator Gardner, you are recognized for 7 minutes, sir.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Senator Thune, for sharing your time, or at least deferring your time to me. And thank you, Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Puche, thank you very much, and Mr. Dorsey, thank you for being here. Mr. Dorsey, I'm going to direct these first questions to you. Mr. Dorsey, do you believe the Holocaust really happened, yes or no?
Yes.
So you would agree that someone who says the Holocaust may not have happened is spreading misinformation, yes or no?
Yes.
I appreciate your answers on this, but they surprise me and probably a lot of other Coloradans and Americans. After all, Iran's Ayatollah has done exactly this, questioning the Holocaust. And yet his tweets remain unflagged on Twitter's platform. You and I agree that moderating your platform makes sense in certain respects.
I fell out for a second.
We don't want the next terrorist finding inspiration on Twitter.
Sorry.
Or any,
this is all part of the experiment.
For that
if we can turn on the live stream, I think this question's being directed to Jack Dorsey, so we can just actually
discuss.
discuss.
Your decisions to do so a little bit better. Can you name
Great, thank you, Sheridan. Sheridan, that's our producer in the back who's keeping everything running. Any reaction to the response to that question?
Oh my God, yes. Ladies first.
Okay. Well, just a couple of things, and I know that Roger will build on this, but you know, in those last remarks, you heard two illegible comments. One is about whether or not these forms of corrupt information on the platform actually constitute violations of Facebook's policies, because he said, you know, we go after anything that violates our policies. And that is a kind of framing that you will hear over and over. So folks, this is me helping you figure out, how do you translate Facebook? Because Facebook is a language, and it's like studying, you know, ancient Aramaic or ancient Greek or Latin. You have to know how to take a statement and translate it into its actual meaning. And since there is no dictionary or lexicon yet published for a sentence-to-sentence translation, I'm gonna help with that. So when he says, you know, we do everything, we take down everything that violates, that's in violation of our policies, our practices, that's code for our standards are set to maximize data flows in our supply chains. Anything that does not violate those standards is considered okay. So Roger and I sat in a room in Ottawa, in the state capital, in the federal capital of Canada. What was it, like a year and a half ago now. It
Year and
can't
a half
be.
ago. Yeah.
God, that
Yeah.
it seems like it was yesterday. And this was the International Grand Committee meeting, and we were there to Roger and I were each there to testify about Facebook's practices, and this was while these hearings were going on. The Nancy Pelosi video was up, the faked video of Nancy Pelosi making her look drunk. It was, it was a real blow to her, to our democracy, to the sanctity of communications of every elected official. And
blue check marks. Blue check marks are spreading false information that aren't flagged. So Twitter must have some kind of list of priority accounts.
Oops, sorry.
Did that volume turn up?
Apologies.
The
Go
Facebook
ahead.
executives were questioned about this and really challenged hard, especially by Damian Collins, MP from the UK. And they kept repeating the same thing over and over again. The video does not violate our policies. The video does not violate our policies. That was their stonewalling of this challenge. And of course, the problem there is not the question of what's right or wrong. The problem is their policies in the first place. They've got the wrong policies. So it's so easy for him to say, we take down everything that violates our policies. They've got the wrong policies. Okay, let me turn it over to you, Roger. I have other things to say. I want to hear what you have to say.
I love the notion of the Zuck to English dictionary, because the basic framing of every problem from Facebook's perspective is to try to distract our attention, to get us to look at the problem narrowly and in a context where they look sympathetic. The reality is all of this stuff stems from a business model, which is guaranteed to create harm for the vast majority of the population. Because if you are manipulating people's choices, if you're manipulating their behavior, there's going to be negative consequences for most people. And, the thing that I would just point out is that it wasn't just the Nancy Pelosi video. Every single month, there is something new and even worse. And every time Mark says, well, we want to bring in outside parties to look at something, that's exactly what happened at NYU. They were brought in to help validate what Facebook was saying it was doing with election advertising, and now Facebook's shutting it down and trying to claim it's over a privacy issue, which is utter nonsense. It's total nonsense. Right. And so, if you just, there's an old saying about lawyers, right? How do you know they're lying? Their lips are moving. Well, that is, in case of Facebook, insincerity is that's their go-to move.
Sorry, Roger, I think we've got another question to Mark, and then I'm going to welcome Shireen and Jessica as well.
Perfect. Well, the brains of the operation.
Sorry, that's a question to Google. So I will, if we can turn the stream down, I'll just welcome Shireen Mitchell, who's the founder of Stop Online Violence Against Women, and Jessica Gonzalez, who's the co-CEO of Free Press. I'll just let you, so we're sort of, as I said, this is a combination live stream and commentary. I've got someone on my side, not physically because of social distancing, but letting me know when questions are being directed to Mark Zuckerberg. So I may cut you off if you're in the middle of talking, so excuse me for that. And when they're questioning other people, we're just discussing the last thing they've said or other aspects of Section 230 and harms created by Facebook. So thank you both for joining. We have Amy Klobuchar asking a question. Let's just go to her real quick.
Partisan topic.
Kyle, I'm going to sign off.
Thank
you, Shoshana.
Witnesses here for appearing, but also
I think that's my sign off too.
That they're doing to try to encourage
All right. Thank you both so much
and to put out
for trying this experiment with us. It's gone well so far.
The president,
it was fun.
Undermining vote by mail, something we're doing in every state in the country right now. Second point, Republicans failed to pass my bipartisan Honest Ads Act. And the White House blatantly blocked the bipartisan election security bill that I had with Senator Langford, as well as several other Republicans. And it's one of the reasons I think we need a new president. Third, my Republican colleagues in the Senate, many of them I work with very well in this committee, but we have had 4 years to do something when it comes to antitrust, privacy, local news, a subject that briefly came up, and so many other things. So I'm going to use my time to focus on what I consider, in Justice Ginsburg's words, to be a blueprint for the future. I'll start with you, Mr. Zuckerberg. How many people log into Facebook every day?
Senator, it is more than 2 billion.
Okay. And how much money have you made on political advertisements in the last 2 years?
Senator, I do not know off the top of my head. It is a relatively small part of our revenue.
Okay, small for you, but I think it's 2.2 billion, over 10,000 ads sold since May 2018. Those are your numbers, and we can check them later. Do you require Facebook employees to review the content of each of the political ads that you sell in order to ensure that they comply with the law and your own internal rules?
Senator, we require all political advertisers to be verified before they could run ads. And I believe we do review advertising as well.
But does a real person actually read the political ads that you sell, yes or no?
Senator, I imagine that a person does not look at every single ad. Our systems are a combination of artificial intelligence systems and people. We have 35,000 people who do content and security review for us, but given the massive amount of...
I really just had a straightforward question because I don't think they do. I think the algorithms hit in because I think the ads instantly are placed. Is that correct?
Senator, my understanding of the way the system works is we have computers and artificial intelligence scan everything. And if we think that there are potential violations, then either the AI system will act or it will flag it to the tens of thousands of people who do content review. But
just with all the money you have, you could have a real person review like a lot of the other traditional media organizations do. So another question, when John McCain and I and Senator Warner introduced the Honest Ads Act, we got pushback from your company, others, and you were initially against it. Then we discussed this at a hearing. You're for it. I appreciate that. And have you spent any of the money? I know you spent the most money, Facebook spent the most money ever lobbying last year. Have you spent any of the money trying to change or block the bill?
Senator, no. In fact, I've endorsed it publicly and we've implemented it into our systems, even though it hasn't become law. I'm a big supporter.
Have you done anything in the past to try to change it? No. Have you done anything to get it passed? Because we're at a roadblock on it. And I do appreciate that you voluntarily implemented some of it, but have you voluntarily implemented the part of the Honest Ads Act where you fully disclose which groups of people are being targeted by political ads?
Senator, we have, I think, industry-leading transparency around political ads, and part of that is showing which audiences, in broad terms, ended up seeing the ads. Of course, getting the right resolution on that is challenging without it becoming a privacy issue, but we've tried to do that and provide as much transparency as we can, and I think we're currently leading in that area. And to your question about how we're...
I still have concerns, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I have such limited time. One of the things that last thing I want to ask you about is divisiveness on the platform. And I know there's been a recent studies have shown that part of your algorithms, they push people towards more polarized content, left, right, whatever. In fact, one of your researchers warned senior executives that our algorithms exploit the human brain's attraction to divisiveness. The way I look at it, more divisiveness, more time on the platform, more time on the platform, the company makes more money. Does that bother you, what it's done to our politics?
Senator, I respectfully disagree with that characterization of how the systems work. We design our systems to show people the content that's going to be the most meaningful to them, which is not trying to be as divisive as possible. Most of the content on the systems is not political. It's things like making sure that you can see when you're your cousin had her baby, or
Okay. I'm gonna move on to Google here and Mr. Pichai, but I'm telling you right now that that's not what I'm talking about. The cousins and the babies here. I'm talking about conspiracy theories and all the things that I think the senators on both sides of the aisle know what I'm talking about, and I think it's been corrosive. Google, Mr. Pichai. I have not.
All right,
really
can we
liked
turn on
your
the
response
stream
to the
while
lawsuit and what's been happening.
and
I think
just
we need a change in
discuss that, please? Thank you, Sheridan. Shireen and Jessica, thank you so much for joining us. It was perfect timing because we got a question there followed by a interesting answer. We're just sort of free flowing, so if either of you want to kick off and just comment on what you've heard and its relationship to reality. Oh, Shireen, I think you're on. Oh,
sorry, Shireen, you're on
Shireen.
mute there. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. I said a relationship to reality is definitely a big question to be asked there. But she asked the right questions, and he still doesn't have an answer, which is our biggest problem here about the way in which the platforms actually is harmful and can be deadly in some situations, as we've seen with Kenosha. And I think the questions about the ways in which the algorithms are working, he's sort of arguing. I actually tweeted about this when he was asked about groups finding recommendations and groups finding people finding certain groups that are white supremacist groups. It was as if there's like a big sign on top of the group that says, "We're white supremacists. Come search for us." And and it was an absurd answer as well, because that's not how the groups are organized, and they also aren't organized in a way that there's some word that's being used you can clearly clearly understand which group this is. Like, from things from patriots to like the red pill. I mean, there are so many different versions of groups that are organized under what was the one? What's the other group? Wolverine Watchmen, right? Wolverine Watchmen is one of the groups that was organized, and that was a spin on like sci-fi to some extent, like the TV series Watchmen, which people wouldn't understand that was about white supremacy, and Wolverine, i.e., the X-Men. So not understanding any of that or having any context, algorithms are not going to determine that that's a white supremacy group that people are organizing to incite violence.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. And it's a common practice to say, oh, we did.
Hi, Kyle.
We removed X million X, but
I can't hear Kyle.
how many didn't you remove? Oh, you can't hear
exactly.
me. Oh.
Let me try and fix that. Sorry.
There we go.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, Jessica, can you hear me now? No, I don't think she can. All right, go ahead, Shireen.
Yeah, sorry about that. So yes, it's and also the conversation about which millions are coming down, right? It's like this is a constant thing. The other thing that he talked about that I don't think we got into detail. I wasn't listening to the group before, those experts before, who are amazing, by the way. Was that when we talk about the ways in which they are pulling things down, we don't know exactly what they're pulling down and where. And he was very candid to still sort of avoid the domestic things in terms of interference. He only talked about foreign interference. So there's caveats to the things that he's saying out loud and on the record. And I think that needs to be clear because this is on the record. And I'm not sure. I don't know if I caught this time, but I don't know if any of them was sworn in. Somebody needs to go back and check that because that's a really big pause there that we should be thinking about as they're testifying right now.
Yeah, we'll check that definitely. Jessica, how is your sound? Are you back on now?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes. Great.
Yay.
Welcome to the party.
It's good to see you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for joining. Looks like we're with Zuck. We'll just get the sound back on the stream.
Mr. Pichai, are you the rev?
Senator, I do think we make content moderation decisions, but we are transparent about it, and we do it to protect users. But we really
should stay on this as content moderation,
maximizing freedom of expression.
Yeah, let's stay with it. Let's see.
I'll take that as three no's, and I agree with that. You are not the referees of our political speech. That's why all three of you have to be more transparent and fair with your content moderation policies and your content selection algorithms, because at the moment, it is, as I said, largely a black box. There's real mistrust among the American people about whether you're being fair or transparent. And this extends to concerns about the kinds of amplification and suppression decisions your platforms may make on Election Day and during the post-election period if the results of the election are too close to call. And so I just want to underscore again for my Democratic friends who keep using this really bad referee analogy, Google, Facebook, and Twitter are not the referees over our democracy. Now, second question, the PACT Act, which I referenced earlier, includes provisions to give users due process and an explanation when content they post is removed. So this is, again, a yes or no question. Do you agree that users should be entitled to due process and an explanation when content they post has been taken down? Mr. Zuckerberg.
Senator, I think that would be a good principle to have.
Thank you. Mr. Dorsey.
Absolutely. We believe in a fair and straightforward appeals process.
Great. Mr. Bashai?
Yes, Senator.
Terrific. Thank you. Mr. Zuckerberg, Mr. Dorsey, your platforms knowingly suppressed or limited the visibility of this New York Post article about the content on Hunter Biden's abandoned laptop. Many in the country are justifiably concerned how often the suppression of major newspaper articles occurs online. And I would say, Mr. Zuckerberg, would you commit to provide for the record a complete list of newspaper articles that Facebook suppressed or limited the distribution of over the past 5 years, along with an explanation of why each article was suppressed or the distribution was limited?
Senator, I can certainly follow up with you and your team to discuss that. We have an independent fact-checking program, as you're saying. We try not to be arbiters of what is true ourselves, but we have partnered with fact-checkers around the world to help assess that, to prevent misinformation and viral hoaxes from becoming widely distributed on our platform. And I believe that the information that they fact check and the content that they fact check is public. So I think that there's probably already a record of this that can be reviewed.
Yeah, but if you could do that as it applies to newspapers, that would be very helpful. And Mr. Dorsey, would you commit to doing the same on behalf of Twitter?
We would absolutely be open to it, and we are suggesting going a step further, which is aligned with what you're introducing in the PACT Act, which is much more transparency around our process, content moderation process, and also the results, the outcomes, and doing that on a regular basis. I do agree and think that builds more accountability, and ultimately that lends itself to more trust.
Okay, great, thank you. All right, very quickly, I don't have a lot of time either, but I often hear from conservative and religious Americans who look at the public statements of your companies, the geographic concentration of your companies, and the political donations of your employees, which often are in the 80 to 90% to Democrat politicians. And you can see why this lack of ideological diversity among the executives and employees of your company could be problematic and may be contributing to some of the distrust among conservatives and Republican users. And so I guess the question that I would ask is, and Mr. Zuckerberg,
really chilling.
My understanding is that the person that's in charge of election integrity and security at Facebook is a former Joe Biden staffer. Is there someone that's closely associated with President Trump who's in the same sort of election integrity role at Facebook? And how do you all respond to that argument
This
that
is such a
there
biased
isn't
question.
sufficient balance?
I have a response to this.
In terms of the political ideology or diversity in your companies, and how do you deal with the lack of sort of trust that creates among conservatives?
Let's see if we can have 3 brief answers there.
Senator, I think having balance is valuable, and we try to do that. I'm not aware of the example that you say of someone in charge of this process who worked for Biden in the past. So we can follow up on that if that's right.
Follow up on the record for the rest of this answer, please, Mr. Zuckerberg. Thank you.
All right,
Mr. Dorsey.
Well, this is why I do believe it's important to have more transparency around our process and our practices.
Let's just let his questioning.
It's independent of the viewpoints.
If actually, he said 3 quick answers, so if we can turn the stream down until they come back to Zuck, maybe. I know, Shireen, you wanted to comment on that, and I wanted to let Jessica come in as well. She hasn't had a chance to. Jessica, do you want to kick us off, actually?
Yes.
Sure. I mean, actually, I think Shireen should go to respond directly to that. I'll give my sort of opening thoughts on broadly why this hearing and why now. So why don't we go to Shireen first?
Okay, great. Shireen, go for it.
So let me just be very clear about that question that was asked, where he said that there's someone from the Biden who worked on the Biden team, or maybe worked for Obama, that went to go work for the tech company. I'm sorry, but every campaign, every group of people who work on certain aspects has either worked for a tech company or worked for the government at some point under some administration. The absurdity to say, oh, let's go find the one Biden person is just ridiculous. Believe me when I say I have been a part of the original framing of doing digital organizing, doing political strategy. I was one of the originators of that framework, along with others during that time. This started as early as 2005, and I can promise
Shireen,
you, almost everybody.
Sorry,
Everybody
Senator Blumenthal's questioning Mark Zuckerberg again.
Sorry.
No.
I was Attorney General of the state of Connecticut. I raised this issue of the absolute immunity that no longer seems appropriate. So I really welcome the bipartisan consensus that we're seeing now, that there needs to be constructive review. But frankly, I am appalled that my Republican colleagues are holding this hearing literally days before an election, when they seem to want to bully and browbeat the platforms here to try to tilt them toward President Trump favor. The timing seems inexplicable, except to game the ref, in effect. I recognize the referee analogy is not completely exact, but that's exactly what they're trying to do, namely to bully and browbeat these platforms to favor President Trump's tweets and posts. And frankly, President Trump has broken all the norms, and he has put on your platforms potentially dangerous and lethal misinformation and disinformation. I'm going to hold up one of them. This one, as you can see, pertains to COVID. We have learned to live with it, he says, just like we are learning to live with COVID, talking about the flu. We have learned to live with it. In most populations, far less lethal. He has said that children, I would say almost definitely, but almost immune from this disease. He has said about the elections, big problems and discrepancies with mail-in ballots all over the USA, must have final total on November 3rd. Fortunately, the platforms are acting to label or take down these kinds of posts, but my Republican colleagues have been silent. They've lost their phones or their voices, and the platforms, in my view, have.
No, we just lost your voice there in mid-sentence, Richard.
I was wondering if that
Tech
was
issue.
us.
That's what I thought too.
Let's
Not us, I
suspend for
promise.
just a minute till we get.
It's a real shame too,
There
because
we
I
are.
think
Okay.
he's making an
We
important
can hear
point
you now,
here
Senator Blumenthal.
about
Yeah.
the why of this hearing and why
Just
now.
start back one sentence before. We had you until then.
I just want to say about this disinformation from the president, there's been deafening silence from my Republican colleagues. And now we have a hearing that is in effect designed to intimidate, fully browbeat the platforms that have labeled disinformation for exactly what it is. We're on the verge of a massive onslaught on the integrity of our elections. President Trump has indicated that he will potentially interfere by posting disinformation on election day or the morning after. The Russians have begun already interfering in our elections. We've all received briefings that are literally chilling about what they are doing, and the FBI and the CSIS have recently issued public alerts that quote foreign actors and cyber criminals likely to spread disinformation regarding 2020 results. They are making 2016 look like child's play in what they are doing. So President Trump and the Republicans have a plan which involves disinformation and misinformation. The Russians have a plan. I want to know whether you have a plan, Facebook, Twitter, Google, a plan if the president uses your platforms to say on the day of the election that there is rigging or fraud without any basis in evidence, or attempts to say that the election is over and the counting of votes must stop either on November 4th or some day subsequent. And I would like, as to this question about whether you have a plan, a yes or no.
Senator, I can start. We do. We have policies related to all of the areas that you just mentioned. Candidates or campaigns trying to delegitimize methods of voting or the election, candidates trying to prematurely declare victory, and candidates trying to spread voter suppression material that is misleading about how, when, or where to vote. So we've taken a number of steps on that front.
Perhaps we could take Mr. Pakai next and then Mr. Dorsey. Mr. Pakai.
Senator, yes, we definitely are robustly, we've been planning for a while, and we rely on raising up news sources through moments like that, as well as we've closely partnered with the Associated Press to make sure we can provide users the most accurate information possible.
And yes, we also have a plan. So, our plan and our enforcement around these issues is pointing to more information, and specifically state election officials. So we want to give the people using the service as much information as possible.
Thank you, Senator Blumenthal. Senator Cruz.
Oh boy.
All right. Well,
Here
this
we
is
go.
probably going to be another.
For this.
We know what Cruz is going to say. There's no worry about what's going to come out of his mouth. Should I continue?
Well, it looks like
Jennifer, do you want to go?
It looks like his sound has failed, or we've just muted it, which is fine. Go ahead, Jessica, or whoever was talking. Sorry, wherever you were leaving off.
I can't remember who was going next. Jessica, was it you?
Yeah, I'll jump in here for a minute. I mean, I'm glad we're muting Ted Cruz. We know what he's going to say. He's got the same talking point about conservative bias that has been debunked time and time again. What I was hoping we could do is actually zoom out from this very sad affair. You know, things have gone terribly wrong when you feel a small bit of pity for tech CEOs. Like, I want to zoom out and talk about this hearing that was called 6 days before Election Day in the United States, that was called by a Senate who just rushed through a SCOTUS confirmation and then decided to go home and not provide COVID relief to the many millions of Americans who are deeply, deeply suffering in this time. But yet it was important enough to return and have this hearing on content moderation on social media sites. This is a bully pulpit approach to beat back any sensible content moderation that's happening on Facebook and other social media sites, and to do a counterpunch to the important work that we've been doing at the Real Facebook Oversight Board, and change the terms and stop hate for profit, and Shireen's work and many other organizations have done for years now to hold these companies, and Facebook in particular, accountable for letting rampant hate and disinformation run wild on their sites. So this is a counterpunch. Let's make no mistake about the why and the why now of this hearing. This is an effort to try to decrease the enforcement that is already incredibly subpar on Facebook's part. We've seen time again, we see Mark Zuckerberg today saying, yes, we have rules against disinformation. We have rules about election integrity. What we actually see is that those rules are poorly enforced, and interventions like this from the Senate Republicans are incredibly chilling. And so when I see this hearing, I think about how Senate Republicans are using the bully pulpit and the threat of legislation to stop the important content moderation that needs to happen to protect the American people. And I think we've really got our priorities mixed up right now in Congress. We've really got our priorities mixed up. Listen, what we've been doing, what we've been building here in movements and at the Real Facebook Oversight Board and in other places is a system to hold platforms accountable to the people, to make the platforms stop acting in a way that harms the American people and people around the globe. And that should be the focus of this hearing, not this conservative bias nonsense, which is a red herring, which study after study shows plainly isn't true. The top trending topics on Twitter and Facebook, by and large, are conservative voices. We need to get our priorities straight, and our priorities ought to be protecting election integrity, protecting our democracy, and protecting people from hate, racism, and violence. And so we need to refocus on those things, and we can't be distracted by the political circus that is happening in the Senate right now. We need to stay strong and continue to work to push these companies to do better. I have to say, the whole debate around voter suppression has been really hard to watch because the conservatives have no commitment to reality or the facts, and you can always cherry pick a few tweets to make your point without really, putting it into context of the whole picture. And so we need to be on alert for that. But when they start going after the social media companies for preventing content that spreads disinformation about the coronavirus, you know how deeply sick our democracy is. I'm a COVID survivor. I'm a long-termer. A friend of mine passed yesterday of COVID. He was in his 30s. The idea that these companies don't have a responsibility to provide and ensure that accurate information about a deadly pandemic, the idea that the Senate would interfere, that Senate Republicans would interfere with that and try to chill any system that's actually trying to bring accountability on the platforms is we've just really got our priorities mixed up, and it's really, really deeply painful for millions of Americans. I guess the last thing I'd say is I really want to put in context here what the government role is versus what is the role of these private companies. The government shall make no law. Congress shall make no law suppressing free expression. What is this hearing? It's meant to chill the expression of these companies that do have First Amendment rights to moderate content on their sites. Now, we can all probably agree that they haven't done enough to moderate content on their sites, but they have a right to do so. And government has no business telling them what to do. And if I were them, I would see my first responsibility to people, not to the powerful, but to people. And I think that's where we need to reset the priorities here, both in the Senate and at these companies. So I'll get off my soapbox and look forward to continuing the conversation. Oh, look, Ted Cruz is still speaking. So
we're grateful to be able to hear from you instead of Ted Cruz. Thank you for
that is
sharing
100%
that.
sure. And I concur with everything you said, Jessica. It's absolutely 100% right. And I think that people don't understand that. It's not even about the fact that we have this conversation around COVID that's killing people, and people are sharing disinformation around it, even to the extent that they're saying that the amount of people who have died is not real. I do 100% believe that part of this is to stop them, which is to say, we work on digital voter suppression. It's to say that these companies have no responsibility to stop the interference that is domestic. That somehow the only responsibility they have is to stop foreign interference. And that's why they're using those examples from Iran and China. These are the narratives that they continue to try to get into the ether. And Jessica's absolutely right. These are private companies. What they do on their platforms has nothing to do with the government. And the second thing that I want to make sure that we're very clear about, because we've tracked this since 2013, the people who are being silenced are the people that are speaking up against the government. There are also the people, i.e. the protesters from Black Lives Matter and the like, but also the people who are basically saying, hey, we want to prevent the types of harm, racism, sexism, incitement to violence upon us as a community, and they're being silenced over those of the powerful, which is what this hearing is about. Those in power want the right to incite violence and inflict harm.
Thank you, Shireen. I think we're going to try and go back real quick. It looks like Senator Schatz is up now. We'll just see what questions. Sorry to cut you off, Jessica.
Of electioneering.
Okay.
No, I was just going to agree with Shireen. So let's go to the
very good reason that we don't call people before us to yell at them for not doing our bidding during an election. It is a misuse of taxpayer dollars. What's happening here is a scar on this committee and the United States Senate. What we are seeing today is an attempt to bully the CEOs of private companies into carrying out a hit job on a presidential candidate by making sure that they push out foreign and domestic misinformation meant to influence the election. To our witnesses today, you and other tech leaders need to stand up to this immoral behavior. The truth is that because some of my colleagues accuse you, your companies, and your employees of being biased or liberal, you have institutionally bent over backwards and overcompensated. You've hired Republican operatives, hosted private dinners with Republican leaders, and in contravention of your terms of service, given special dispensation to right-wing voices and even throttled progressive journalism. Simply put, the Republicans have been successful in this play. And so during one of the most consequential elections in American history, my colleagues are trying to run this play again, and it is an embarrassment. I have plenty of questions for the witnesses on Section 230, on antitrust, on privacy, on anti-Semitism, on their relationship with journalism. But we have to call this hearing what it is. It's a sham. And so for the first time in my 8 years in the United States Senate, I'm not going to use my time to ask any questions because this is nonsense. And it's not going to work this time. This play my colleagues are running did not start today. And it's not just happening here in the Senate. It is a coordinated effort by Republicans across the government. Last May, President Trump issued an executive order designed to narrow the protections of Section 230 to discourage platforms from engaging in content moderation on their own sites. After it was issued, President Trump started tweeting that Section 230 should be repealed, as if he understands Section 230. In the last 6 months, President Trump has tweeted repeal Section 230 5 times, in addition to other tweets in which he's threatened the tech companies. A few weeks later, President Trump withdrew the nomination of FCC Commissioner Mike O'Reilly. Republican Commissioner O'Reilly questioned the FCC's authority to regulate under Section 230, and the statute is not unclear on this. President Trump then nominated Nathan Symington, who was the drafter of NTIA's petition to the FCC regarding Section 230. And Republican senators have enthusiastically participated. Since June of this year, 6 Republican-only bills have been introduced, all of which threaten platforms' ability to moderate content on their site. And as the election draws closer, this Republican effort has become more and more aggressive. September 23rd, DOJ unveiled its own Section 230 draft legislation that would narrow the protections under the current law and discourage platforms from moderating content on their own site. September 14th and October 1st, respectively, Senators Hawley and Kennedy tried to pass their Republican-only Section 230 bills via live unanimous consent. Now, what that means is they went down to the floor and without a legislative hearing, without any input from Democrats at all, they tried to pass something so foundational to the internet unanimously without any discussion and any debate. On the same day as Senator Kennedy's UC attempt, Senator Wicker forced the Commerce Committee, without any discussion or negotiation beforehand, to vote on subpoenaing the CEOs of Twitter, Facebook, and Google to testify. That's why we're here today. 2 weeks later, on October 14th, Justice Clarence Thomas, on his own, issued a statement that appeared to support the narrowing of the court's interpretation on Section 230. The very next day, the FCC chairman, Ajit Pai, announced that the FCC would seek to clarify the meaning of Section 230. On that day, Senator Graham announced that the Judiciary Committee would vote to subpoena the tech companies over the content moderation. And the context of this, in addition to everything, is that Senator Cruz is on Maria Bartiromo talking about a blockbuster story from the New York Post. Senator Hawley is on Fox and on the Senate floor. And the Commerce Committee itself is tweeting out a campaign-style video that sort of alarmingly says Hunter Biden's emails, tech censorship. On October 21st, Senator Hawley reattempted to pass his bill on Section 230 via UC, again without going through any committee markup or vote. And on Friday, Senator Graham announced that the CEOs of Facebook and Twitter would testify before the Senate Judiciary Committee on November 17th. This is bullying, and it is for electoral purposes. Do not let the United States Senate bully you into carrying the water for those who want to advance misinformation. And don't let the specter of removing Section 230 protections or an amendment to antitrust law or any other kinds of threats cause you to be a party to the subversion of our democracy. I will be glad to participate in good faith bipartisan hearings on these issues when the election is over. But this is not that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Schatz.
Senator Schatz. Next is Senator Fisher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I'm not here to bully you today, and I am certainly not here to read any kind of political statement right before an election. To me, this hearing is not a sham. I am here to gain
just see where this
some
goes.
clarity on the policies that you use I am here to look at your proposals for more transparency, because your platforms have become an integral part of our democratic process for both candidates, but also more importantly for our citizens as well. Your platforms also have enormous power to manipulate user behavior and to direct content.
Yeah, if we can turn
and
down
to shape narratives. Mr.
the
Dorsey.
audio, we can perhaps discuss that. Thoughts on how Senator Schatz used his time, the broader point he's trying to make, or just sort of your interpretation of that?
I mean, I thought he was spot on in his analysis of the purpose of this hearing. And I think it's kind of brilliant to not use the time to ask questions and instead to lay out the very political and partisan nature of this bully pulpit hearing. So while I do want to see these tech CEOs be asked very hard questions, given the nature of this hearing and the timing of it, I think it was a legitimate use of his time.
Particularly the political nature, isn't it? 6 days before an election.
Right.
Exactly.
Shireen?
It's another version of trying to be an October surprise, right? They've been desperate to look for one, which is why they're talking about the Biden situation, right? And the post that everyone fact checked and said there was a problem. And it wasn't just Facebook in that instance being fact checked on their particular platform, but it was about it being fact checked across the whole media landscape. And the concept that somehow that is something Facebook should have done different when we've seen it across the media landscape, and then they bring this as a debate here today is telling that's the kind of disinformation they want to continue to spread, and they find that acceptable. And I think that the key aspects here about what is happening is exactly what he just said, which is this is about trying to, shake the tech companies from shutting down disinformation, because disinformation has basically worked for this particular party, and they're looking for ways to continue to be able to do that. And when I say disinformation, though, I want to make sure, because we focus largely on digital voter suppression, we have voter suppression that's been happening in this country for years. And so this is just another version of that. And the concept that they should have the right to spread disinformation because they're politicians, that people with money should be able to spread disinformation, that PACs should have the right to spread disinformation without being held accountable, while users are being held accountable for doing simple things like as speaking up against the wrongs in their community. That we have a fundamental flaw in the way that we look at our country as a whole, and what power means when people are in positions of power, and it's that one person versus their constituency base. It's the same thing I feel about Facebook and others. The user base should be the most important thing, not the one or two politicians. Like
right.
How many do we have in Congress? 530 something, right?
Mm-hmm.
They should not have more power than the millions of Americans.
Oh, Shireen, we've lost you.
That's what this argument's about.
Oh, you're back. Sorry, we lost your audio
I'm
for a
sorry.
second. No, you came back. No, I think that's a really important point to pick up on. It seems to me that the conservatives tend to frame the idea of balance as a balance between a left point of view and a right point of view, regardless of fact. Whereas, and so the conversation seems to be missing the point around the idea of what is truth, what is factual, as opposed to what is a left opinion or a right opinion. Are you interpreting it that way at all as well, or am I misreading it? Because it seems to me that it's just this constant push of like Republican. Well, this is a Republican point of view. Well, it's false. It's not true.
Yeah, absolutely. 100%. I mean, part of what these platforms have been doing in the first place was sort of balancing politicians, right, conservative biases against civil rights organizations and civil rights lawyers. Explain that balance, because that's not a balance. And they've done that. Facebook has done that when they would being called out about their civil rights audit, right? There were the people who were working on that were civil rights organizations, those who are working with people on the ground, and lawyers, and they were comparing that narrative to what politicians on the right were debating about. And they weren't doing left and right in the context of what left politicians were asking versus what right politicians were asking. They were basically comparing right politicians to civil rights groups and human rights groups. And that doesn't make any sense to have that kind of comparison. But that's why we're here, because that's what they're saying.
Sorry, Shireen, it looks like she's questioning Mark Zuckerberg now. Let's go back to that if we can.
Regarding content moderation that you've heard so far this morning.
Senator, I would outline a couple. First, I agree with Jack that increasing transparency into the content moderation process would be an important step for building trust and accountability. One thing that we already do at Facebook is every quarter we issue a transparency report where for each of the 20 or so categories of harmful content that we are trying to address, so terrorism, child exploitation, incitement of violence, pornography, different types of content.
Sorry, we're getting a little feedback from
we
you.
issue a report on how we're doing, what the prevalence of that content is on our network, and what percent of it our systems are able to take down before someone even has to report it to us. And what the precision is, and and basically how accurate our systems are at dealing with it, and getting to the point where everyone across the industry is reporting on a baseline like that, I think would be valuable for people to have these discussions, not just about anecdotes of, okay, I saw a piece of content and I'm not necessarily sure I agree with how that was moderated. It would allow the conversation to move to data so that way we can understand how these platforms are performing overall and hold them accountable.
Thank you.
At issue with your answer, I think, would be the time involved, that it wouldn't be an immediate response to have that conversation, as you call it. I hope that all three of you gentlemen can answer that question in written questions. So my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. I appreciate that. We are going to take now Senator Cantwell's
great. We want to hear this for sure.
We are going to accommodate our witnesses with
They all say they want to do
5-minute
transparency, but
recess. So Senator Cantwell, you are recognized.
they don't do it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Can you hear me?
Surely can.
And can you see me this time?
We can now see you, yes.
Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is such an important hearing. I agree with many of the statements my colleagues have had, that this hearing didn't need to take place at this moment, that the important discussion about how we keep a thriving internet economy and how we continue to make sure that hate speech and misinformation is taken down from the web is something that would probably better been done in January than now. But here we are today, and we've heard some astounding things that I definitely must refute. First of all, I'm not going to take lightly anybody who tries to undermine mail-in voting. Mail-in voting in the United States of America is safe. The state of Washington, the state of Oregon have been doing it for years. There is nothing wrong with our mail-in system. So I think that there'll be secretaries of state, there'll be our law enforcement agencies who've worked hard with state election officials, and others who will be talking about how this process works and how we're going to fight to protect it. I'm also going to not demean an organization just because they happen to be headquartered in the state of Washington or to have business there. That somebody claims that just because the geography of a company somehow makes it uber political for one side of the aisle or another, I seriously doubt. I know that because I see many of you coming to the state of Washington for Republican fundraisers with these officials. I know you know darn well that there are plenty of Republicans that work in high-tech firms. So the notion that somehow these people are crossing the aisle because of something and creating censorship, the notion that free speech is about the ability to say things, and it doesn't take, well, maybe we need to have a history lesson from high school again, but yes, free speech means that people can make outrageous statements about their beliefs. So I think that the CEOs are telling us here what their process is for taking down healthcare information that's in fact, that's not true, that is a threat to the public, and information that is a threat to our democracy. That is what they're talking about. So I want to make it clear that this hearing could have happened at a later date, and I don't appreciate the misinformation that is coming across today that is trying to undermine our election process. It is safe. It is the backbone of what distinguishes America from other countries in the world. We do know how to have a safe and fair election. And one of the ways that we're doing that is to have these individuals work with our law enforcement entities. My colleague, Gary Peters, made it very clear. They successfully helped stop a threat on the governor of Michigan. And why? Because they were working with them to make sure that information was passed on. So this is what we're talking about. We're talking about whether we're going to be on the side of freedom and information, and whether we're going to put our shoulder to the wheel to continue to make sure that engine is there, or whether we're going to prematurely try to get rid of 230 and squash free speech. And so I want to make sure that we continue to move forward. So Mr. Zuckerberg, I'd like to turn to you, because there was a time where there was great concern about what happened in Myanmar, about the government using information against a Muslim minority, and you took action and reformed the system. And just recently, in September, Facebook and Twitter announced they had suspended networks accounts linked to various organizations and for use of techniques laundering Russian-backed websites, accounts, and derisive propaganda that we associated with state-run attempts to interfere in our elections. So could you please, Mr. Zuckerberg, talk about what you are doing to make sure state-run entities don't interfere in U.S. elections?
Yes, thank you, Senator. Since 2016, we've been building up some very sophisticated systems to make sure that we can stop foreign interference in elections, not just in the US, but all around the world. And a lot of this involves building up AI systems to identify when clusters of accounts aren't behaving in the way that a normal person would. They're behaving as fake accounts in some coordinated way. A lot of this is also about forming partnerships. The tech companies here today work more closely together to share signals about what's happening on the different platforms to be able to combat these threats, as well as working more closely with law enforcement and intelligence communities around the world. And the net result of that is that over the last few years, we've taken down more than 100 networks that were potentially attempting to spread misinformation or interfere. A lot of them were coming from Russia or Iran, a growing number from China as well. And at this point, I'm proud that our company and as well as the others in the industry, I think, have built systems that are very effective at this. We can't stop countries like Russia from trying to interfere in an election. Only the U.S. government can really push back and with the appropriate leverage to do that. But we have built up systems to make sure that we can identify much faster when they're attempting to do that. And I think that should give the American people a good amount of confidence leading into this election.
And is it true that those entities are trying to find domestic sources to help with that misinformation?
Senator, yes, the tactics of these different governments are certainly evolving, including trying to find people outside of their country. And in some cases, we're seeing domestic interference operations as well. And the systems have had to evolve to be able to identify and take those down as well. Of the 100 or so networks that I just cited that we took down, about half were domestic operations at this point, and that's in various countries around the world, not primarily in the U.S. But this is a global phenomenon that we need to make sure that we continue pushing forward aggressively on.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Pichai, I'd like to turn to you for a second, because I do want information from Facebook on this point too, but I'd like to turn to you. There's information now from
we'll stay until
media
Facebook answers
organizations that it may be as much as 30 to 50% of Google ad revenue, of that broadcasters and newsprint are losing somewhere between 30 and 50% of their revenue that they could be getting to newspapers and broadcasting, losing it to the formats that Google has as it relates to their platform and ad information. Can you confirm what information you have about this? And do you think that Google is taking ad revenue from these news sources in an unfair way?
Senator, it's an important topic. It's a complex topic. I do think journalism, as you rightfully have called attention to it, particularly local journalism, is very important. The internet has been a tremendously disrupting force, and the pandemic has exacerbated it. I'm happy today as Google, I would make the case that we believe in raising news across our products because we realize the importance of journalism. We send a lot of traffic to news publishers. All the ad technology questions I'm getting asked today, we invest in ad technology, share a majority of revenue back to publishers. We are investing in subscription products. We have committed to $1 billion in new licensing over the next 3 years to news organizations. We have set up local emergency fund through COVID for local journalistic institutions. I could give plenty of examples, but the underlying forces which are impacting the industry, which is the internet, and whether it's Google, if not Google, advertisers are finding alternate sources.
Yeah, I don't have a clock on me, so I don't know how much time I have to.
You're a minute and a half over, but so let's see.
Okay, well, I'll just leave it with this, that Mr. Picott, you hit on the key word, majority. I don't think that you return the majority of the revenue to these broadcast entities. I do
All
think
right,
it's
if
a
we
problem.
can turn
Yes,
down the
they've had
live
to make it through
stream.
the transformation, which is a rocky transformation.
Yeah, they're going to go to recess, so we'll have a little bit of time to chat now.
Great.
I don't really know what to say. It felt like a bit of a wasted 6 minutes, 7 minutes.
Well, I mean,
I wasn't really sure where she was headed, but what do you think, Jessica?
I think she has a valid point here that as we see ad revenue increasingly going to social media entities that are spreading disinformation, we've also seen a decline in local news sources. We've lost over 50% of local journalists in the last 12 years here in the US. So it's a legitimate concern. I think there's real questions about whether the tech industry is responsible for the loss of local journalism. But I do want to go back to the New York Post story and talk a bit about the way Free Press sees this. As some may know, Free Press was a huge force behind net neutrality. We believe that internet service providers, not edge platforms like Google and Facebook, ought to let traffic run freely. And in fact, that happened in this case, right? New York Post posted the story on its own website, and that is where it was published. Anyone can have access to it there. They don't have a right to have that story shared and amplified, especially if it contains false and misleading information that can suppress the vote or mislead voters ahead of the US election. They don't have a right to amplification. They have a right to have their website run and have their internet service provider not interfere with that traffic. That's net neutrality, and we support that. They don't have a right to platform neutrality. There's a huge difference there, right? Like that story ran. It was available to people if they wanted to see it. That doesn't mean that Twitter and Facebook should be required to amplify it on their platforms. So I think that's an important distinction that we need to be talking about more here.
Well, and I think that's a really good point. And I'll pose the question to both of you, but please speak to anything else as well. But the phrase democratic accountability has come back up a few times, and sort of the idea of the platform making the decision versus a government making a decision as to how free expression is exercised. I'm just curious to your thoughts in the sense that obviously the monopolistic nature of the companies, so they can dominate an entire democratic forum, as it's sort of being seen and how it's being used now. But does that mean that we should have rules in law that would sort of arbitrate a question like this one, or is that a step too far?
I mean, I think we're seeing here how that process could be fundamentally abused, right? By people who want, have political motives. So I'm not saying there's no role for the government. And I certainly think that big tech needs to be reined in on a number of issues, including privacy, and they need to pay more taxes and a number of things. But, whether or not we should have governments making decisions about what we see and hear over the platforms, I think is very, it's really, this hearing is an example of why I'm a little bit nervous about that.
Yeah. So I would say that I think that Jessica's making a very important distinction here that was brought up in this hearing, which is the freedom of net neutrality, which is drastically different than freedom of speech. And also, I think that there's a disconnect here because people keep talking about freedom of expression without admitting that part of the things about expression that are not protected is death threats, incitement to violence. We're having this conversation as if these things are not connected to what Section 230 does. Section 230 does allow for these platforms to not be held accountable for what the users produce as content. However, the law does not allow incitement to violence. The law does not allow death threats. So they, as a platform, should be taking down that content. It does not matter who, by the way, is putting that content out. So if it's a politician, if it's a PAC, if it's somebody with money, that content should come down. Hate speech, all of that should come down. We haven't done that. We have not admitted to doing any of that. We're having a conversation about that should still be alive on these platforms with disclaimers, which I find problematic. They should not exist. The disinformation and misinformation is a question about disclaimers to me, but not this conversation about incitement to violence or death threats of any form. We have worked with other organizations that tracked many of these groups, some of which have not been taken down yet, where they basically had users and all this content organizing and basically saying, shoot them all, meaning shoot all the protesters for simply protesting, which is not something this country was ever founded on. But the concept that should be alive or that groups should exist with that kind of content is a fundamental difference of this debate that we're having.
Yeah, thank you, Shireen. And I want to welcome our handover. Thank you so much for joining us this late at this late hour where you are. If you don't mind just introducing yourself, and then I'll just run you through how it's all working. I'm not sure if you've caught any of it yet. It's been interesting.
Kyle, I have to jump.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica.
Excuse me, but I just want to, as I take off here, I just want to say we're being served a false choice. Like this is a left or right issue, and it's not. It's a right or wrong issue, and just want to thank everyone here for all the incredible work that you've been doing. Big fans of all of you, and take care.
Likewise, thank you.
Jessica,
Have a good
great
day.
being here with you as always. We're all on the same page.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Do you hear me at all?
Yes, we hear you. Yeah.
Right.
Go ahead, please introduce yourself to everybody.
I'm Nayantara Ranganathan. I'm joining from India, and I work on a project around political advertising transparency in some ways. It's called Persuasion Lab. And yeah, well, it was super interesting to see the hearing so far and also listen to the comments of Shireen and Jessica, as well as the senator who kind of broke it down why the whole hearing has been a sham. And actually that was really interesting because, well, let's say that a lot of in the previous months, Facebook employees have been called up by different committees in India for different reasons, including misinformation, hate speech, and so on. And one of the committees that was exploring whether or not what was Facebook's role in a particular kind of pogrom or riots that happened in Delhi. The reason that one of the Facebook employees gave to not appear was that the committee did not have jurisdiction to issue summons to a Facebook employee. And in fact, he also filed a petition with the court to say that the summons itself was creating a chilling effect on people using the platform. So it was quite fascinating to see how, like, you know, the Senate hearing is happening, what the tech CEOs' responses have been like, and of course, all of your reactions.
Yeah, so just we're on a recess, so we have an opportunity to sort of catch up. You've been watching, what is your main takeaway so far as we sort of enter the second half here?
Right. I think what was quite strong was this kind of false promise of transparency that was being made across issues, like whether it was, I think, around hate speech and misinformation, political ads, all of that. I think Zuckerberg kind of made it seem as if, well, it was quite clear that they have been leading efforts on transparency. And I had to take big issue with that for so many reasons. And maybe I will try to break down some of those. So let's say, to start with, I think the data set or the kind of data that Facebook makes available as political advertising transparency does not at all reveal anything about the intentions of the advertisers or what incentives that the platform is using to deliver ads to different people, you know, how it targets. So that I find is one of the central reasons why this promise of transparency has been entirely hollow. It mostly kind of gives the kind of information that is that does not have as much teeth and that does not entirely threaten Facebook's business model at all. The kinds of information that does matter, like ad spend or impressions, which is kind of central to understanding the impact, you know, the numbers.
Oh, I'm so sorry. We're just I have to keep doing this, but we're just going to jump back to the hearing and see what these questions are posed. Apologies.
Annually on content moderation, how many people work in general in the area of content moderation, including by private contract? Let me just start with those two questions. Ultimately, I also want to ask you, how much money does your company spend in defending lawsuits stemming from user content on the platform?
Okay, Mr. Zuckerberg, you want to go first there?
Senator, we have more than 35,000 people who work on content and safety review, and I believe our budget is multiple billions of dollars a year on this. I think upwards of $3 or maybe even more $1 billion a year, which is a greater amount in revenue that we're spending on this than the whole revenue of our company was the year before we filed to go public in 2012.
Thank you.
Senator, we use both a combination of human reviewers and AI moderation systems. We have well over 10,000 reviewers, and we are investing there significantly. And I would again, not sure of the exact numbers, but I would say it's in the order of over $1 billion we spend on these things.
Thank you, Mr. Dorsey.
I don't have the specific numbers, but we want to maintain agility between the people that we have working on this, and also just building better technology to automate it. So our goal is flexibility here.
Let me ask the question again about how much would you estimate that your company is currently spending on defending lawsuits related to user content?
In the same order, okay?
Senator, I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, but I can get back to you.
Thank you.
Senator, we do spend a lot on legal lawsuits, but not sure what of it applies to content-related issues, but happy to follow.
Thank you.
And I don't have those numbers.
Let me use your answers to highlight something that I want to be a topic of our conversation as we debate this legislation. whatever the numbers are, you indicate that they are significant. It's an enormous amount of money and an enormous amount of employee time, contract labor time in dealing with modification of content. These efforts are expensive, and I would highlight for my colleagues on the committee that they will not be any less expensive, perhaps less in scale, but not less in cost for startups and small businesses. And as we develop our policies in regard to this topic, I want to make certain that
see where he's going,
startup businesses and small business are considered in what it would cost in their efforts to meet the kind of standards that to operate in this sphere. Let me quickly turn to federal privacy. I chair the Consumer Data Privacy Security Act. We've tried for months, Senator Blumenthal and I, to develop a bipartisan piece of legislation. We were close, but unsuccessful in doing so. Let me ask Mr. Zuckerberg. Facebook entered into a consent order with the FTC in July of 2012 for violations of the FTC Act, and later agreed to pay a $5 billion penalty along with a robust settlement order in 2018 following the Cambridge Analytica incident that violated the 2012 order. My legislation will provide the FTC with first-time civil penalty authority. Do you think this type of enforcement tool for the FTC would better deter unfair and deceptive practices than the current enforcement regime?
Senator, I would need to understand it in a little bit more detail before weighing in on this. But I think that the settlement that we have with the FTC, we're going to be setting up an industry-leading privacy program. We have, I think, more than 1,000 engineers working on the privacy program now, and we're basically implementing a program which is sort of the equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley's financial regulation around kind of internal auditing and controls around privacy and protecting people's data as well. So I think that settlement will be quite effective in ensuring that people's data and privacy are protected.
Mr. Pichai, Google, YouTube's $170 million settlement with the FTC, and
I think we might just lower that for a bit and discuss. It was getting quite technical and built on a lot of sort of details that it would be difficult for them to have in that moment. I just wanted to, there was a few things I picked up, a quote, industry-leading privacy program. Obviously, re-raising Cambridge Analytica, the massive data breach, and what I call like the constant mention of large numbers. So 35,000 people doing content moderation. I guess the question I always have is, well, how many do they need? Not how many do they have? So if Nyantarj, if you wanted to take that or anything else you wanted to speak on, and if I interrupt again, it's just because someone from our team is telling me there's an interesting question being asked. So go ahead, and I'll bring in Shireen after.
Right. No worries on the interruptions. But I think from Cambridge Analytica to kind of most responses of Facebook, I find it important to understand how kind of the PR department language, I mean, the PR department of the biggest advertising company, the language that they come up with also makes its way into kind of legislative frameworks and legal frameworks, So I find it quite problematic that a lot of like legal language is kind of going in the direction of the terms of framing that Facebook comes up with, or Facebook and the other companies come up with. And I think that's the most striking thing, that even with the Cambridge Analytica incident, it eventually ended up kind of diverting attention to Cambridge Analytica, as if Facebook had it was more of a negligence issue and not really like something that they have been facilitating more systematically. And yeah, I think that goes back also to the way that I find I mean, I think there's a lot that has been said and written about this, but also the depoliticized kind of language of like good actors, bad actors, entirely devoid of any like value and understanding. And these are kind of often picked up very uncritically into legislations. I mean, sometimes, somewhat more kind of less ridiculous sounding words, but even things like political ads that Facebook, that Zuckerberg just now said that it's a very small portion of our revenue. But that's because of which ads you classify as political and which you don't. And that is really a decision that Facebook takes in extremely subjective ways, which currently is as simplistic as if it is advocacy, it would be political. If it is commerce, it would be not political. And all the not political set, which kind of Zuckerberg says is 99.5% of the revenue they make. It does not come
And they're
under the
actually,
transparency framework.
and they're actually dictating those terms. Senator Markey's back with a question. Apologies again.
No,
they're moving at pace now.
You failed to take down that post. Within a day, the post had hundreds of thousands of shares and likes on Facebook. Since then, the president has gone on national television and told a hate group to, quote, stand by. And he has repeatedly refused to commit that he will accept the election results. Mr. Zuckerberg, can you commit that if the president goes on Facebook and encourages violence after election results are announced, that you will make sure your company's algorithms don't spread that content and you will immediately remove those messages?
Senator, yes, incitement of violence is against our policy, and there are not exceptions to that, including for politicians.
There are exceptions, did you say?
There are not exceptions.
There are no exceptions, which is very important because obviously there could be messages that are sent that could throw our democracy into chaos. And a lot of it can be and will be created if social media sites do not police what the president says. Mr. Zuckerberg, if President Trump shares Russian or Iranian disinformation, lying about the outcome of the election, can you commit that you will make sure your algorithms do not amplify that content and that you will immediately take that content down?
Senator, we have a policy in place that prevents any candidate or campaign from prematurely declaring victory or trying to delegitimize the result of the election. And what we will do in that case is we will append some factual information to any post that is trying to do that. So if someone says that they won the election when a result isn't in, for example, we will append a piece of information to that saying that official election results are not in yet. So that way, anyone who sees that post will see that context in line. And also, if one of the candidates tries to prematurely declare victory or cite an incorrect result, we have a precaution that we've built in to put at the top of the Facebook app for everyone who signs in the US information about the accurate US election voting results. I think that this is a very important issue to make sure that people can get accurate information about the results of the election.
Yeah, it cannot be stated as being anything less than critically important. Democracy could be seriously challenged beginning next Tuesday evening and for several days afterwards, maybe longer. And a lot of responsibility is going to be on the shoulders of Facebook and our other witnesses today. Mr. Zuckerberg, if President Trump uses his Facebook account to call for armed private citizens to patrol the polls on Election Day, which would constitute illegal voter intimidation in violation of the Voting Rights Act, will you commit that your algorithms will not spread that content and that you will immediately take that content down?
Senator, my understanding is that content like what you're saying would violate our voter suppression policies and would come down.
Okay, again, the stakes are going to be very high, and we're going to take that as a commitment that you will do that, because obviously we would otherwise have a serious question mark placed over our elections. We know Facebook cares about one thing, keeping users glued to its platform. One of the ways you do that is with Facebook groups. Mr. Zuckerberg, in 2017, you announced a goal of 1 billion users joining Facebook groups. Unfortunately, these forum pages have become breeding grounds for hate, echo chambers of misinformation, and venues for coordination of violence. Again, Facebook is not only failing to take these pages down, it is actively spreading these pages and helping these groups' recruitment efforts. Facebook's own internal research found that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to Facebook's recommendation tools. Mr. Zuckerberg, will you commit to stopping all group recommendations on your platform until U.S. election results are certified, yes or no?
Senator, we have taken the step of stopping recommendations and groups for all political content or social issue groups as a precaution for this. But just to clarify one thing, the vast majority of groups and communities that people are a part of are not extremist organizations or even political. They're interest-based and communities that I think are quite helpful and healthy for people to be a part of. I do think we need to make sure that our recommendation algorithm doesn't encourage people to join extremist groups. That's something that we have already taken a number of steps on, and I agree with you is very important that we continue to make progress on.
Well, your algorithms are promoting online spaces that foster political violence. At the very least, you should disable those algorithms that are recruiting users during this most sensitive period of our democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Mr. Zuckerberg, let me just ask you this. In these scenarios that Senator Markey was posing, that the action of Facebook would not be a function of algorithms in those cases, would it?
Senator, I think that you're right, and that's a good clarification. A lot of this is more about enforcement of content policies. Some of the questions were about algorithms. I think group ranking is an algorithm, but broadly, I think a lot of it is content enforcement.
Thank you for clarifying that. Senator Blackburn, you are recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank each of you for coming to us voluntarily.
We're going to jump off
that.
the next questions, and if they are good questions, we'll tune back in. But there was so much that was just said there around the idea of content versus algorithms, group recommendations. Shireen, I know that this is an area that you have worked a lot on. I just wanted to go to you first and see if you had any thoughts.
So absolutely, listening to that conversation is another example of like this comparisons that are not equatable, right? For example, when we talk about left versus right politically, we know that there's a problem there. But the other part of this that is really important that I think that we're missing is about the fact that content moderation versus the algorithms that suggest things are very different. And another thing that's not being said here, which I don't understand, is that no one knows, like if you think about what happened in 2016 with the Russian interference, nobody knew what group they were in that was a bad thing because they were being influenced in a positive way until the bad information was injected later. And if you're basically saying that you can somehow capture that in this moment is ridiculous with algorithms or the like. And so when people are talking about content, he's talking about content moderation. He's trying to make this comparison between, well, hey, we have aspects where we have to worry about what people are pushing out versus what the algorithms do with that content, and they're not equivalent or in the sense that they are equal to each other. What the algorithms do in terms of detecting hate speech is the kind of thing that we want to work with the algorithms to do. But this recommendation thing is very different. Nobody knows. Even Facebook doesn't know what their algorithms are doing for these recommendations. So the concept that somehow this is not an algorithmic problem is ridiculous. Because we know that when people get reported, it's because something got elevated in their feed, but in their news feed by the algorithms. it doesn't, like, I don't understand why we're sort of why we're trying to make this distinction. This distinction doesn't make any sense. And also the piece that I think that was important about what he said is that any politician pushing out this disinformation after the election should be taken down. Zuckerberg agreed to that. So I want to know if that's going to happen and whether or not we'll have another hearing about what Zuckerberg or what Facebook has done to take down content from politicians who were pushing disinformation. Like he said yes to that. It should not matter. I know for a fact with the work that we do, it does matter because I've seen those. So the issue areas that he tried to compare to political issues, social issues versus politics. Me telling the story about my community and what's happening in my community is not the same thing as it being political, unless you're saying that my identity and my experience in America is political just because of who I am. Because whatever content I produce about trying to stop racism and sexism in my community should not be classified as political. It's a civil rights and human rights issue. And the comparison to that, to politics, is the fundamental debate that we're having in this moment with this conversation.
And Nayantara, we talk a lot about, it's been, the point's been made quite often that the US often approaches these issues as if they're new and original, when in actual fact there's a great deal the US could be learning from incidents and events that have happened abroad. When you hear those types of commitments in the run up to the US election, does it make you think, oh, he's probably telling the truth this time, maybe it'll work? Or, there's no record to suggest this has happened, so why would we believe him now? What sort of, context can you lay on that for us?
Right. I think my reading is kind of consistent with what Shireen said, and also I think what a large majority of the work that the Real Facebook Oversight Board has been kind of pointing to. And I think you're right that a lot of these issues are not new, but also in the way that when we try to raise attention to it, it has to be kind of translated in terms that can be understood to an American audience. And when I hear what Zuckerberg is saying, I don't think it's like a special insight coming from India, but a lot of times incitement to violence and the commitment to stop those kind of posts assumes that all dangerous content or all content like that necessarily says, okay, let's go torch this person or let's go lynch this place or something. But often, a lot of times, the legal threshold that kind of evolved in older kinds of media of what is considered hate speech is quite high. And sometimes it's a lot of suggestive content. It's a lot of metaphors. It's a lot of symbolism and like news shared about things. So I find that these are not like new issues, and also I think not new to the US from what I understand of the work, so much work happening there. And yeah, it seems like entirely disingenuous, as well as kind of the typical Facebook playbook, to kind of have this best efforts basis kind of response that constantly is trying to move and shift and look as if things are happening, but at the same time with entirely depoliticized commitments. Yeah. But of course, the reflexivity with which things work in the US, of course, is far more than any kind of response that I guess I receive in other parts of the world.
And there seems to be this constant push to make a distinction between content and algorithms, and really present them as two different things. This is a content issue, not an algorithm issue. I just wondered, can we pull them apart? Are they mutually exclusive? Or, I mean, I feel like I'm probably asking a rhetorical question, but
and I think Facebook kind of thrives on that distinction in many ways. And I don't know if this is like a clear relation with what Shireen was talking about, but the idea that what is and what is not political is entirely on the basis of content of the ads, as opposed to the fact that in any case, delivery of any content happens on the basis of an algorithmic decision, like whether it is a paid post, whether it is what is called an organic post, but what is like there is no elemental kind of natural quality to the way that these posts move. So of course, the way that content moves has been algorithmic, and of course, and definitely this is a distinction also I find benefits Facebook in many ways.
Shireen, what do you have any thoughts on that? The splitting of algorithms and content?
Absolutely, I completely agree that that the aspect that we're dealing with in this regard is the lack of understanding about these two things as if they're the same, and that happens a lot in this work. Just like the Section 230 argument, like we're having a Section 230 argument about content because content users are producing certain X, Y, Z things, but the First Amendment does not protect incitement to violence or death threats. So we should not be having a censorship conversation about Section 230 when if the content is incitement to violence. Like free expression is one thing, but there's the law against incitement to violence and death threats should not be a debatable conversation in Section 230. And the way that things get flattened means that we're not having those detailed conversations. I think Jessica said this before she exited, the way in which we're saying left and right versus, right or wrong. The flattening of these issues make it difficult. And honestly, this feeds into the disinformation, in my opinion, where we can't get to solving the issue. So when you flatten the algorithms versus the content, we're not having a conversation about what the algorithms are doing. By the way, I have a hashtag, actually a term that I use all the time, which is there's no tech fix for the human condition. So an algorithm is not going to solve for the bad things that humans will do, right? So let's just get to that. So the content that's being produced, that is the bad things that humans will do, needs to be addressed full frontal. What the algorithms are doing after that content has been produced is a different debate. They're not the same debate, but that does not mean we ignore the algorithmic frameworks that are going on here. Because if you're being recommended, like what YouTube has recommended content that is, if you go down a conspiracy theory rabbit hole, they're going to keep showing you conspiracy theories because of what you're clicking on. Like, that's true. The content exists. The algorithms are suggesting it to you. That's a problem. And we should be talking about why that's a problem, particularly when the suggestions are more conspiracy theories and when it's into groups that are inciting violence.
Yeah, it's often said that I think Senator Udall's up, so we might go back to that in just a second. I'm just going to say it's often said that the idea is that algorithms can somehow fix bad behavior, as you say, but algorithms and artificial intelligence are driven by machine learning, and machine learning often just it goes even further than what the human's condition does because its objective is to predict human behavior. So
exactly, it's based on our nature. The machine is trying to learn our nature. We're acting like our human nature is not the thing that's telling the algorithms what to do, as if they're separate. If we have the content that is hate speech, that is disinformation, that is targeting certain groups, all the algorithm is going to do, like the Microsoft. Do you remember that incident when Microsoft had an AI that went on Twitter to have a conversation with people, and all of a sudden the AI turned into a racist?
Yeah,
that's
I think
because
was it 4 hours or it only took 40 minutes?
I think it was like 12 hours. I think it was a total of maybe 12 hours. But by the time it learned to be racist because the content that was being fed it was from humans.
And that sort of goes back to this question around, human moderation. What would it cost? Again, 35,000 people doing content moderation. Okay, well, how many do we need to actively be able to human? Oh, questions have started with Senator Udall. We'll just jump back to the hearing now.
Okay, I have an answer to that though. When we come back?
We'll come back to it, I promise.
One from Iran, Group APD 35, targeting the Trump campaign. One from China, a Group APD 31, targeting the Biden campaign. Most of this were phishing attempts. Our spam filters were able to remove most of the emails out from reaching users, but we notified intelligence agencies, and that's an example of the kind of activity we see. And I think it's an area where we would need strong cooperation with government agencies moving forward.
Mr. Zucker. Senator, like Jack and Sundar, We also see continued attempts by Russia and other countries, especially Iran and China, to run these kind of information operations. We also see an increase in kind of domestic operations around the world. Fortunately, we've been able to build partnerships across the industry, both with the companies here today and with law enforcement and the intelligence community, to be able to share signals to identify these threats sooner. And along the lines of what you mentioned earlier, one of the threats that the FBI has alerted our companies and the public to was the possibility of a hack and leak operation in the days or weeks leading up to this election. So you had both the public testimony from the FBI and in private meetings, alerts that were given to at least our company, I assume the others as well, that suggested that we be on high alert and sensitivity, that if a trove of documents appeared, that we should view that with suspicion, that it might be part of a foreign manipulation attempt. So that's what we're seeing, and I'm happy to go into more detail as well if that's helpful.
Okay, thank you very much. And this one's a really simple question, I think a yes or no. Will you continue to push back against this kind of foreign interference, even if powerful Republicans threaten to take official action against your companies? Mr. Zuckerberg, why don't we start with you and work the other way back?
Senator, absolutely. This is incredibly important for our democracy, and we're committed to doing this work.
Senator, absolutely. Protecting our civic and democratic process is fundamental to what we do, and we will do everything we can.
Yes, and we will continue to work and push back on any manipulation of the platform.
Thank you for those answers. Mr. Zuckerberg, do Facebook and other social media networks have an obligation to prevent disinformation and malicious actors spreading conspiracy theories, dangerous health disinformation, and hate speech, even if preventing its spread means less traffic and potentially less advertising revenue for Facebook?
Senator, in general, yes. I think that for foreign countries trying to interfere in democracy, I think that is a relatively clear-cut question where I would hope that no one disagrees that we don't want foreign countries or governments trying to interfere in our elections, whether through disinformation or fake accounts or anything like that. Around health misinformation, we're in the middle of a pandemic. It's a health emergency. I certainly think that this is a high sensitivity time. So we're treating with extra sensitivity any misinformation that could lead to harm around COVID, that would lead people to not get the right treatments or to not take the right security precautions. We do draw a distinction between harmful misinformation and information that's just wrong, and we take a harder line and more enforcement against harmful misinformation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Udall. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being with us today. I would say that any time that we can get the three of you in front of the American people, whether it's several days before an election or several days after, is extremely useful and can be very productive. So I appreciate the three of you coming and the committee holding this hearing. As we've heard, Americans turn every day to your platforms for a lot of different information. I would like to give a shout out to Mr. Zuckerberg, because the last time he was in front of our committee, I had asked him to share the plenty of Facebook into rural America and help us with our fiber deployments into rural America. And when we see in this COVID environment, we see how important that is. And he followed through with that. I would like to thank him and his company for helping partner with us in West Virginia to get more people connected. And I think that is an essential. I would make a suggestion as well, maybe when we get to the end, when we talk about fines, what I think we could do with these millions and billion-dollar fines that some of your companies have been penalized on. We could make a great jump and get to that last household.
This sounds like a completely. This sounds like it's posting its own disinformation. So if I heard the main thing I picked up from that section was the idea of harmful disinformation versus information that's just wrong. And I know, Shireen, you wanted to pick up on a previous point as well. So if you wanted to start us off, if something comes interesting, I'll let you know and we'll go back to it. But oh, I think you're on mute, Shireen.
Oh,
there you go. No, you're right.
Oh,
You're good now.
Okay. I think I'm sorry. I think I forgot the point I was going to make before because this thing keeps moving. But the thing that I want to say right now in reference to this is that this aspect of hate speech, the concept that that they are taking down content that's harmful. I just said this already earlier. We have a report that went out about shoot them all, and those groups are still up. So what he's making a statement about. Oh, I have 2 points here. But the statement that he's making is not an accurate statement because if there's a group of people who is saying shoot them all, that's incitement to violence, and any group that still has that, or any group that's still up, should be taken down. And so they're saying harmful, but they're picking and choosing which levels of harm. And in my opinion, some of this picking and choosing, they're also picking and choosing who's going to be harmed. And I think that when people see Black Lives Matter and this intent to say that they're the violent ones when they're the ones trying to protect themselves from being killed, that we are actually fundamentally in a flawed framework of what he's considering harmful and what other people is considering harmful. That somehow protesters should be shot down, and the people on their platform should be able to say that and not have anyone be held accountable is problematic. In the same vein of any politician, including the person at the highest office in this on the land, who's inciting violence against people, like what happened to Meg Whitmer in Florida. Like, we are not having a conversation about what that incitement of violence really looks like and what's harmful language. The other thing that he said that I think was really key, that I think some people might have missed. He basically said disinformation and interference in our election, especially China and India, in Iran. Sorry, I didn't mean to say India. Please forgive me. And Iran, which is a Republican narrative. There is a difference between what China is doing with IP interference and hacking interference versus what Russia's doing, which is election interference. And the flattening of this, even with foreign interference, is another example that I talk about. When you flatten foreign interference, you're not digging into the differences. Russia is spending enormous amount of time from 2016 to present to interfere in our elections. And that means looking at our voting rolls, looking at other things that like what's happening on the state level. That in itself is a different level of election interference versus what China may be doing with using tech, IP violations, or what we may go into some conversations about privacy violations. Those are drastically different things. So so when he said especially China and Iran, he was catering to the Republican talking point, which I find fundamentally problematic.
And again, sort of pitching to the idea of foreign interference. So like, that's the bad actor, not us.
Not us.
It's a pretty common, diversionary tactic. Nayantar, do you have any other thoughts about that section, or anything else with regard to what we're seeing?
And Kyle, you're gonna have to remember the thing I said I need to talk about before we went off air, because I forgot what that was.
I'll try and remember.
Okay, me too.
Right. No, well, I think there was a lot that was said, and I think I just fully agree that a lot of different kinds of harmful content, especially Islamophobic content in many parts of India, for example, has been a question of this does not look harmful to us by Facebook when it has been reported, which in any case should not be the way that things, the process that kind of technically can scale. And this question of harmful to whom is kind of obvious on the face of anyone that is listening to him. But of course, I feel like this is part of an entire self-defeating reiteration of just like new policies, new commitments, new classifications in their systems that ultimately do not address problems that have been framed very clearly with evidence whatnot.
And so, like, what are the biggest problems that are not being addressed? Like, what is this whole thing missing?
I think, I mean, I don't know, I find that at the heart of a lot of this is this kind of idea that neutrality of the platform, right? I think the inability to name harms, the inability to kind of, I guess, kind of their business model ruling the roost. I think Zuckerberg's back, so maybe you want to listen to him.
Oh, yeah, yeah, if we can go back to live stream, the questions were less than great earlier. Let's see what he's answering to now.
Until a certain scale, or is it a minimum taken into account as a serious factor to make sure that we're not preventing the next set of ideas from getting built?
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin.
Perfect timing.
Thank you. I'd like to begin by making 2 points. I believe the Republicans have called this hearing in order to support a false narrative fabricated by the president to help his reelection prospects. And number 2, I believe that the tech companies here today need to take more action, not less, to combat misinformation, including misinformation on the election, misinformation on the COVID-19 pandemic, and misinformation and posts meant to incite violence. And that should include misinformation spread by President Trump on their platforms. So I want to start with asking the committee clerk to bring up my first slide. Mr. Dorsey, I appreciate the work that Twitter has done to flag or even take down false or misleading information about
Let's stay with this because I'm interested to see where she goes.
October 11th tweet by the president claiming he has immunity from the virus after contracting it and recovering, contrary to what the medical community tells us. Just yesterday morning, the president tweeted this, that the media is incorrectly focused on the pandemic and that our nation is, quote, rounding the turn on COVID-19. In fact, according to Johns Hopkins University, in the past week, the 7-day national average of new cases reached its highest level ever. And in my home state of Wisconsin, case counts continue to reach record levels. Yesterday, Wisconsin set a new record with 64 deaths and 5,462 new confirmed cases of COVID-19. That is not rounding the turn, but it's also not a tweet that was flagged or taken down. Mr. Dorsey, given the volume of misleading posts about COVID-19 out there, do you prioritize removal based on something like the reach or audience of a particular user of Twitter?
I could be mistaken, but it looks like the tweet that you showed actually did have a label pointing to both of them, pointing to our COVID resource hub in our interface. So in regards to misleading information, we have policies against manipulated media in support of public health and COVID information, and election interference and civic integrity. And we take action on it. In some cases, it's labeling. In some cases, it's removal.
What additional steps are you planning to take to address dangerously misleading tweets like the president's rounding the turn tweet?
We want to make sure that we are giving people as much information as possible, and that ultimately we're connecting the dots. When they see information like that, that they have an easy way to get an official resource or many more viewpoints on what they're seeing. So we'll continue to refine our policy. We'll continue to refine our enforcement around misleading information. And we're looking deeply at how we can evolve our product to do the same.
Mr. Zuckerberg, I want to turn to you to talk about the ongoing issue of right-wing militias using Facebook as a platform to organize and promote violence. Could the committee clerk please bring up my second slide? On August 25th, a self-described militia group called Kenosha Guard created a Facebook event page entitled Armed Citizens to Protect Our Lives and Property, encouraging armed individuals to go to Kenosha and, quote, defend the city during a period of civil unrest following the police shooting of Jacob Blake. That evening, a 17-year-old from Illinois did just that and ended up killing 2 protesters and seriously injuring a third. Commenters in this group wrote that they wanted to kill looters and rioters and switch to real bullets and put a stop to these rioting, impetuous children. While Facebook has already had a policy in place banning militia groups, this page remained in place. According to press reports, Facebook received more than 450 complaints about this page, but your content moderators did not remove it, something you subsequently called an operational mistake. Recently, as you heard earlier in questions, the alleged plot to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer and the potential for intimidation or even violence at voting locations show that the proliferation of the threat of violence on Facebook remains a very real and urgent problem. Mr. Zuckerberg, in light of the operational mistake around Kenosha, what steps has Facebook taken to ensure that your platform is not being used to promote more of this type of violence?
Thank you, Senator. This is a big area of concern for me personally and for the company. We've strengthened our policies to prohibit any militarized social movement. So any kind of militia like this. We've also banned conspiracy networks. So QAnon being the largest example of that. That is completely prohibited on Facebook at this point, which, you know, in this period where I'm personally worried about the potential of increased civil unrest, making sure that those groups can't organize on Facebook may cut off some legitimate uses, but I think that they will also preclude greater potential for organizing any harm. And by making the policy simpler, we will also make it so that there are fewer mistakes in content moderation. So I feel like we're in a much stronger place on the policies on this at this point.
Thank you, Senator Baldwin. Senator Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to read a few quotes from each of you, each of our 3 witnesses, and from your companies, and then I may ask for a response. So, Mr. Zuckerberg,
we'll just
this one's from
see what quotes he reads.
You said, quote, "We've built Facebook to be a platform for all ideas. Our community's success depends on everyone feeling comfortable sharing what they want. It doesn't make sense for our mission or for our business to suppress political content or prevent anyone from seeing what matters most to them." You said that, I believe, on May 18th, 2016. Mr. Dorsey, on September 5th, 2018, you said, "Let me be clear about one important and foundational fact. Twitter does
if we can turn the volume of the stream down, please, Sheridan.
to make
Thank you.
any
It
decisions."
seems he's going to go down the route of suggesting that conservative voices are silenced again. If that's not the case, then we'll go back to it. But it's not
he's doing the conservative voices thing. He's also talking about political, like they would not suppress political arguments, as if again that if political arguments include incitement to violence, hate speech, or the like, should not be shut down. Like it's this assumption that all political arguments are equal and don't have issues. And now, Kyle, I actually remember what I was going to say. Because he talked about the content moderation and who's moderating, even though we're talking about the content that Zuck has basically, in many instances, sort of pushed off to the failures of the content moderators, the humans, which he did not hold accountable for himself. The other piece of that I want to make sure that people understand is we're not just asking about how many do they have, but how diverse are they? Do they understand what goes on in the white supremacy framework enough in America to understand what that looks like when that incitement to violence is happening, like what was brought up about Kenosha. Like, we are not having the same conversation, because what I have seen is that multiple ways in which these platforms will get outside contractors, i.e., those in other countries, moderating a process in America that has no understanding of the foundation of what hate speech in America is, particularly to certain groups, i.e., Black Americans, Latin Americans, and other aspects. I think that when we look at this, we're not looking at this from a full spectrum about who's in the moderation process. We also have to remind ourselves, and I want to just make sure that I say this because I said this before, about the way in which the moderation process that Facebook had initially basically protected white men over Black children in the process when it first started out. And then we got into versions where they were protecting white nationalism as if that was different than white supremacy, until activists said something different about that. So what we're still not dealing with is what's in their moderation process, who's protected still in the moderation process, who's not, and who's monitoring from either of those groups, particularly the groups that are the most targeted and marginalized groups. Because I feel strongly that if we dig deeper into that conversation, we're not seeing the diversity of those who would understand what a target on a community of color looks like, particularly when it's
In the
coming
United States.
from a white supremacist.
So there's a context question here for the moderators themselves. They're being put in extremely unfair circumstances to be moderating content that isn't necessarily related to their context. I want to bring Nayantar in and just get your thoughts. I also want to mention that it's about turning the hour, so some people may join. Just let them join, and as you did, and we'll just carry on.
Yes.
Nayantar.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just have to agree with a lot of what Shireen said, and I guess I don't have the kind of contextual understanding of the US, but it definitely has been the case that even with Indian content moderators, they are unable to appreciate, when they're not from marginalized communities, the problematics of what, like, who is the content harming? Like the question that came up before of harmful misinformation versus misinformation that's just wrong. I think then really depends upon the person that is assessing it, whether they feel equally threatened or not. And I think I just have to echo what Shireen said about that.
Yeah, I also, the other thing I wanted to pick up on is, I think so far he's made about 3 commitments around the election. And I just wonder, how do we hold Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg accountable on these commitments around, ensuring violence doesn't happen, ensuring the integrity of the election? What means exist now and what means should exist?
I mean, Kyle, we would be remiss to talk about the ways in which they're trying to shut down the project at NYU that's trying to keep a transparency on those political ads, right? Like, how will we know if they're the ones that are? He said in one of these answers is that we need the internal researchers from Facebook, but also external researchers. But your actions, who says that you're going to shut down a transparency project, means that that's not true. Like, and no one corrected him on the record about that, because we see that happening as well.
Right, once you're on the platform.
And so the conversation that the 3 things that he's trying to be held accountable for are, we've known this before. He said, I'm sorry, I don't know how many hundreds of times since 2004. Or I'm sorry, I know I'm going too far, but like, in my opinion is, but the key to that is that he's saying he's going to be accountable for these things. But as we're having this conversation, we're watching where he's saying hate speech coming from users is something that they will moderate, especially if it incites harm. But he's also sort of waving back a little bit that if it comes from a politician, that maybe they won't take it down because of things like this with this hearing. That it's sort of flattened into being political versus the actual content is harmful. And so again, we're not having a distinction between the content itself and what they're going to do, and then also this level of transparency that he's saying that he's opening the door for, but also at the same time, we know that they're trying to shut down a transparency project right now.
Yeah,
It
yeah,
says
and that's
on
the
it.
NYU project. Oh, great. I think we got Jim. Can you hear me, Jim?
I don't know what I'm supposed to. Lisa, like I'm on, right? What do I do?
He can't hear us, I don't think.
I don't think you can hear us now.
I'm not looking.
Sheridan, are you able to see if we can get Jim, maybe just to refresh?
Okay, I'm on.
Oh, great. I think Sheridan was able to mute him.
Yeah. Okay, where Jim's muted.
Thanks, Sheridan.
Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks.
So, Kyle, you were going to follow up on the transparency project thing.
Oh yeah, I was just thank you. Thanks for the reminder, Shireen. We've been at this now for 3 hours, so I appreciate the reminder. Yeah, so it was just to remind people that it's the NYU project that collects anonymous data on political ads that people see to keep to do research. And he says, we're verbatim, he said, we want to collaborate with academics, and of course they were issued with a cease and desist to stop their project. And it's been compared to Cambridge Analytica, which of course it's nothing like, because the data is taken with consent and it's anonymized. Let's see, Jim, can you hear me now?
I can hear you fine, yes. Can you guys hear me?
Great. Yes, sorry about that. Welcome to the hour. You're with Shireen Nayantara, your fellow Brain Stress members. And Jim, if you just want to just introduce yourself briefly. I know you also just recently wrote a piece about Section 230.
That's right.
And then just so you know, for format, I might interrupt you if they jump to something interesting that he's saying.
Fine. So
Go for it.
I'm Jim Steyer. I'm the founder and CEO of Common Sense Media. The biggest kids media and advocacy group. I'm also a Stanford professor. I am the co-founder of the Stop Hate for Profit Coalition, which we have been pushing. And I did write a book called Talking Back to Facebook in 2012 that was focused on the impact of Facebook and other platforms on the social, emotional, and cognitive development of children. We're the principal authors of the California Consumer Privacy Act in 2018, the lead sponsors of the ballot initiative this year. And as Kyle said, I just came out with a book called Which Side of History? How Technology is Reshaping Democracy in Our Lives. And it's a collection of 50 essays by people, Mint Shoshana, Roger McNamee, many other people who've been part of this effort. And my piece with Bruce Reed, the senior policy advisor for Joe Biden, is about why Section 230 needs to be overhauled and why it's bad for kids.
All right.
So delighted to be on. Thank you, Kyle.
Thank you so much, Jim. Sorry, my first interruption. If we can go back to the hearing, Senator Tammy Duckworth is posing her questions.
Great.
And they do this while the commander-in-chief cowers in fear of Russia and stubbornly refuses to take any action to criticize or warn Russia against endangering our troops. I have confidence in the United States Armed Forces, intelligence community, and civil servants. Their effective performance explains why our foreign adversaries have sought alternative avenues to attacking our nation. Afraid to face us in conventional military or diplomatic ways, they look for unconventional means to weaken our democracy, and they realize that social media could be the exhaust port of our democracy. Social media is so pervasive in the daily lives of Americans and traditional media outlets that it can be weaponized to manipulate the public discourse and destabilize our institutions. You know, after Russia was incredibly successful in disrupting our democracy 4 years ago, all of our adversaries learned a chilling lesson. Social media companies cannot be trusted to put patriotism above profit. Facebook and Twitter utterly failed to hinder Russia's sweeping and systemic interference in our 2016 election, which used the platforms to infiltrate our communities, spread disinformation, and turn Americans against one another. Of course, the situation has grown far worse today, as evidenced by today's partisan sham hearing. While corporations may plead ignorance prior to the 2016 election, President Trump and his Republican enablers in the Senate have no such excuse. Senate Republicans cut a deal to become the party of Trump, and now they find themselves playing a very dangerous game. By encouraging Russia's illegal hacking, by serving as the spreaders and promoters of disinformation cooked up by foreign intelligence services, and by falsely claiming censorship when responsible actors attempt to prevent hostile foreign adversaries from interfering in our elections, Senate Republicans insult the efforts of true patriots working to counter malign interference and weaken our security. This committee is playing politics at a time when responsible public officials should be doing everything to preserve confidence in our system of elections and system of government. The reckless actions of Donald Trump and Senate Republicans do not let technology companies off the hook. None of the companies testifying before our committee today are helpless in the face of threats to our democracy, small d democracy. Federal law provides your respective companies with authority to counter foreign disinformation and counterintelligence propaganda. And I want to be absolutely clear, gentlemen, that I fully expect each of you to do so. Each of you will be attacked by the president, Senate Republicans, and right-wing media for countering hostile foreign interference in our election. But you have a duty to do the right thing, because facts still exist. Facts still matter. Facts save lives, and there's no both sides when one side has chosen to reject truth and embrace poisonous false information. So in closing, I would like to each witness to provide a personal commitment that your respective companies will proactively counter domestic disinformation that spreads the dangerous lies such as masks don't work, while aggressively identifying and removing disinformation that is part of foreign adversaries' efforts to interfere in our election or undermine our democracy. Do I have that commitment from each of you gentlemen?
Okay, we'll take Dorsey, Pakai, and then Zuckerberg. Mr. Dorsey.
We have made that commitment.
Mr. Pakai.
Senator, absolutely yes.
And Mr. Zuckerberg.
Yes, Senator. I agree with that.
Thank you. Your industry's success or failure in achieving this goal will have far-reaching life or death consequences for the American people and the future of our democracy. Thank you, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The senator yields back. Senator Johnson.
Kyle, I have to sign off.
I'd like to start with a question for all three of the witnesses. You know, you have public reports that you have different chat forums in all of your companies, and also public reports where, you know, the few conservatives that might work for your companies have certainly been harassed on those types of forums. I don't expect you to have taken poll of your employees, but I just want to get a kind of a sense, because I think it's pretty obvious. But would you say that the political ideology of the employees in your company is, you know, let's say 50-50, conservative versus liberal progressive, or do you think it's closer to 90% liberal, 10% conservative? We'll start with Mr. Dorsey.
As you mentioned, I don't know the makeup of our employees because it's not something we ask or focus on.
But just what do you think off the top of your head based on your chat rooms and kind of the people you talk to?
Not something I look for or look
Yeah, right. Okay, Mr. Pichai.
Senator, we have over 100,000 employees. For the past 2 years, we have hired greater than 50% of our workforce outside California. It does tend to be proportionate to the areas where we are in, but we have 1 million message boards at Google. We have groups like Republicans at, Liberals at, Conservatives at, and so on. And we have definitely made an effort to make sure people of all viewpoints are welcome.
So again, you want to, Mr. Zuckerberg, will you answer the question honestly? Is it 90-10 or 50-50? Which is it closer to?
Senator, I don't know the exact number, but I would guess that our employee base skews left-leaning.
Thank you for that honesty. Mr. Dorsey, you started your opening comments that you know, you think that people don't trust you. I agree with that. We don't trust you. You all say you're fair and you're consistent, you're neutral, you're unbiased. Mr. Dorsey, I think the most incredible answer I've seen so far in this hearing is when Senator Cruz asked, does Twitter have the ability to influence elections? Again, does Twitter have the ability to influence elections? You said no. Did you stick with that answer, that you don't even believe? And let's face it, you all believe that Russia has the ability to influence elections or interfere by using your social platforms. Mr. Dorsey, do you still deny that you don't have the ability to influence and interfere in our elections?
My answer was around people's choice around other communication channels.
No, your answer was, the question was, does Twitter have the ability to influence elections? You said no. Do you still stand by that answer?
Twitter as a company, no. No,
You don't think you have the ability by moderation policies, by, as Senator Lee would call, and I would call it censoring, what you did with the New York Post. You don't think that censorship, that moderation of policies, you don't think that influences elections by withholding what I believe is true information from the American public? You don't think that interferes in elections?
Not our current moderation policies. Our current moderation policies are to protect the conversation and the integrity of the conversation around the elections.
Okay, for both Mr. Zuckerberg and Dorsey, who censored New York Post stories or throttled them back, do either one of you have any evidence that the New York Post story is part of Russian disinformation, or that those emails aren't authentic? Do any of you have any information whatsoever they're not authentic, or that they are Russian disinformation? Mr. Dorsey,
we don't.
So why would you censor it? Why did you prevent that from being disseminated on your platform that is supposed to be for the free expression of ideas, and particularly true ideas?
We believed it fell afoul of our hacking materials policy. We judged in a
Well,
moment.
what evidence did you have that it was hacked? They weren't hacked.
We judged in a moment that it looked like it was hacked materials.
You were wrong.
Surfacing, and we updated our policy and our enforcement within 24 hours.
Mr. Zuckerman? Mr. Zuckerberg?
Senator, as I testified before, we relied heavily on the FBI's intelligence and alerts to us, both through their public testimony and private briefings and alerts they gave us.
Did the FBI contact you and say the New York Post story was false?
Senator, not about that story specifically.
Why did you throttle
in
it back?
general.
Why did you throttle it back?
They alerted us to be on heightened alert around a risk of hack and leak operations, around a release of information. And Senator, to be clear on this, we didn't censor the content. We flagged it for fact checkers to review, and pending that review, we temporarily constrained its distribution to make sure that it didn't spread wildly while it was being reviewed. But it's not up to us either to determine whether it's Russian interference nor whether it's true. We rely on the FBI and intelligence and fact checkers to do that.
Mr. Dorsey, you talked about your policies toward misinformation, and that you will block misinformation if it's against civic integrity, election interference, or voter suppression. Let me give you a tweet that was put up on Twitter. It says, Senator Ron Johnson is my neighbor and strangled our dog Buttons right in front of my 4-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter. The police refuse to investigate. This is a complete lie, but important to retweet and note that there are more of my lies to come. Now, we contacted Twitter and we asked them to take it down, and here's the response. Thanks for reaching out. We escalated this to our support team for their review, and they have determined that this is not a violation of our policies. So, Mr. Dorsey, how could a complete lie, it's admitted it's a lie, how does that not affect civic integrity? How could you view that not as being election interference? Let's face it, that could definitely impact my ability to get reelected. How could that not be a violation of voter suppression?
Jim, can you hear me?
If people think I'm strangling my neighbor's dog, they may
This,
show up at the polls.
I'd be happy to comment at any point.
There we go. Sorry, it was my sound that was off. I was chatting to myself, but I could see all of you. I want to quickly welcome Yael Eisenstadt. Yael, welcome. You jumped on right as Senator Johnson really went for it there, down a line of thought. Jim, you were already talking. Do you want to come in first, and then we'll just bring everyone in? It's just a free flow conversation, just in response to the questions and the responses. And I may interrupt if the hearing jumps back to something relevant. So excuse my interruptions.
So I would just start by saying that Section 230 is an incredibly important issue to examine. It has an incredible impact. The tech companies have indeed had basic immunity from from any kind of regulation of content on their platform as publishers, unlike other major publishers, all other major publishers. So these are really important issues, but this is a politicized hearing now. So what you have, instead of a really thoughtful discussion of Section 230 and how Section 230 needs to be overhauled to protect kids and families and democracy, that's a very important, critical discussion, particularly in the context of Facebook, which has been the amplifier and spreader of more misinformation and false information for anyone. What you see now is sort of a political charade where you have senators trying to influence the election. And it's quite amazing. Then they're focusing on this bizarre New York Post story that obviously had many factual issues involved. So unfortunately, this is not a healthy, thoughtful discussion of Section 230. It is a sham exercise. And again, Common Sense is a completely nonpartisan organization. So we do not care which side of the aisle people are on. We want a serious discussion, though, of Section 230, and hopefully we will get one in 2021. But this discussion, certainly Senator Johnson's comments are, I mean, crazy. They're not at all about what Section 230 is about. He has a political vendetta against Jack Dorsey. And you watch Mark Zuckerberg, who is the head of the biggest platform that's been the biggest problem in the context of misinformation, disinformation, and election hacking, whether it was 2016, 2018, or the current election, where we've been extremely critical for that. And yet the questions are not about that at all. They're just a political charade. That said, the bigger issues involved with Section 230 are critically important, and I'm sure my colleagues on the panel would agree. But this is exactly how Washington, and particularly some of these senators like Johnson, are just completely messing up the discussion and confusing it with partisan political rhetoric as opposed to addressing the serious issues that go to the heart of a thoughtful discussion of Section 230 and regulation that should be in place in 2021 and beyond. My colleagues. That's my take.
I just want to. Sorry, Shireen. I just want to see what Senator Tester asks, and then we can bring it back. And I want to bring in Yael first as our most recent arrival. If we can bring the volume up, thanks.
The United States Senate, an equal part of an independent branch of government, allows the Senate's halls to be used for the president's political stunts. There is a national election in 6 days, Mr. Chairman. You had nearly 2 years to hold this hearing, and it's happening 6 days before the election. The idea that we should have a sober hearing about putting the reins on big tech 6 days before the election, quite frankly, doesn't pass the smell test. Today, this hearing is about electoral politics. I know it, you know it, everybody in this room knows it. And I know the American people are smart enough to figure that out. I'm going to talk a little more about that in a second. But first, I want to thank the panel once again for being here. And I want to start by asking a question about making a more sincere effort to discuss the issues that surround big tech down the road. So the question for the panel, and this is a yes or no answer, will you commit to returning to testify again in the new Congress? Start with you, Jack.
Yes, we're always happy to, myself or one of our teammates is always happy to talk to American people.
Sundar?
Senator, yes, we have engaged many times, and we are happy to continue that engagement with Congress.
How about you, Mark?
Senator, yes, I hope we can continue to have this conversation, and hopefully not just with the CEOs of the companies, but also with experts who work on these issues every day as part of their jobs.
Absolutely. I think the more information, the better, but not based on politics, based on reality. And I want to thank you for that, because we are in a very unreal time when it comes to politics. Quite frankly, we are in a time when fake news is real and real news is fake. And you guys try to shut down the fake news, whether it comes from Joe Biden's mouth or whether it comes from Donald Trump's mouth. And the fact is, if Joe Biden said some of the crazy and offensive stuff that the president has said, he would get fact checked in the same way. Wouldn't you agree? You can nod your head to that. Wouldn't you agree? If Joe Biden said the same stuff that Trump said, that you would do the same sort of fact checking on him?
Shall we take Mr. Dorsey, Mr. Pakai, and Mr. Zuckerberg in that order?
If we found violations of our policy, we would do the appropriate enforcement action.
Thank you. Zuckerberg?
I think if we can turn the volume of the hearing down and just come back to a chat, it's a fairly rhetorical line of questioning. I'm just curious, the idea, of course, this is like extremely politicized, 6 days before the election. Yael, like, are we going to get anything useful from this context? And, more broadly, what should we be talking about? What from your perspective are the biggest issues?
Sure. And I'm going to try to get this all out. You see me looking down to my right. I have a little baby puppy who's destroying my feet just so I can sit here right now. So I don't know how long I'm going to last. I thought he'd be asleep.
We're grateful to have you. Thanks.
Section 230, for anybody who's read anything I've written or listened to me speak, this is one of the issues I care about most. This is one of the issues that I think is the most important to have a really serious, smart, reasoned debate about. Because at the end of the day, it's not about whether or not we should end Section 230, we should keep Section 230. For me, it's a completely outdated law that has been way too broadly interpreted by the courts to give this unbelievable amount of freedom from immunity from any sort of accountability to these platforms. Now, today's hearing, unfortunately, is completely political. Today's hearing is about certain people grandstanding in the last week of our election and making lots of false claims about how Twitter's censoring the president. They have never censored him. They have put fact check labels. That's not the same thing as censoring. But I do think a few little things might come out of this. Some of the questions I've heard today have been pretty smart, and some of them also, don't forget, can be used for the future. I mean, I'm just going to point out one tiny little example when I don't remember which senator it was, asked Mark Zuckerberg about the report in the Wall Street Journal that had claimed that internal Facebook employees had done this report proving that Facebook's own algorithms were actually responsible for driving more people towards extreme content and for recommending more people into extreme groups. And Mark Zuckerberg said he wasn't familiar with that report. I think it's important every single time you get one of these guys to lie on the record. I think that is something you can use in the future. I do not believe for a second that Mark Zuckerberg was not familiar with that report. But anyway, on a broader level, I'll give my really quick version of what I would love to see with Section 230. I have said this in many venues before. I don't want a company necessarily held responsible for what somebody else writes on their platform, right? I don't think that if somebody if an individual writes something hateful on Facebook and that's it, that's the whole story, then no, I don't necessarily think that's Mark Zuckerberg's responsibility. However, if Facebook's algorithm amplifies that post, if Facebook's recommendation engine recommends people to either follow this person or join a group that this person's in, if Facebook in any way curates that particular post to be in my feed, that's where the responsibility lies. Because to claim that they're just this neutral platform and people can just post on the platform and they have no responsibility, in addition to having sophisticated targeting tools that they give political operatives and bad actors and sellers of sneakers equally these sophisticated targeting tools to do as they please with, their algorithms are what is steering us towards certain content, what is pushing people towards certain views. And so again, it's not about an individual's piece of speech, in my opinion. It's about the tools that you are providing and the tools that people are using and gaming to amplify that kind of hateful speech. And the last thing I'll say really quickly here is one of the problems about Section 230 is this absolutist way people talk about it, right? And it's on purpose, because if you can talk about it in an absolutist way, then there's no way to ever solve it, right? It's either about free speech or censorship. It's either about killing all innovation or allowing innovation, right? It's always these really strong binaries. And I actually call BS on all of those arguments. I think in the case of companies like Facebook and Google and probably Twitter as well, what we need to talk about is, do they even fit into the definition of what we're talking about to begin with? They're not a publisher in the sense of like a New York Times. They're not the ones doing their own writing, fact checking, source validation, and all of that. And so I don't actually want them necessarily to be held accountable in the same way as a media company. They are certainly not just a neutral, like the pipes. They're not just a neutral intermediary. That would be like a Squarespace. If I want to build a website using that software, then I should be held responsible for what I put on that website. Facebook is something completely different. I would call them something like a digital curator. They're the ones who are actually deciding what content you see, how you are targeted with content and ads, what groups they're recommending you into. And so I think in 2020, it's time to create a whole new category and then decide what are the rules around how to regulate that, as opposed to this BS blanket 230 immunity for anything that ever had the word internet in it. And I do think you could figure out what sort of transparency rules, what sort of laws would you have to have around transparency around how your algorithms work or what your recommendation engines were doing. But I think on a first principles level, we first have to decide, who are these companies? What are they actually? And do we want to forever give them complete immunity from any accountability for the real world things happening off platform that were facilitated by the tools that they developed? And they will claim it's just so hard. You know what? Somehow you managed to scale to become to dominate the entire world's communications and how we receive information and how we connect with people. But when it comes to actually ensuring that you aren't causing harm, it's suddenly too hard. So I would just look at it at a little bit more high level of, this is an incredibly important conversation. It's not going to be solved today.
Thanks, Yael. Jim and then Shireen, do you want to comment on that?
So I'm going to have to run soon. So can I go first and then
yeah,
you guys
sure,
can
Shireen.
continue?
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I agree with this argument around everything that was just discussed. I think that that's an important piece. I also I don't want to leave this before we go, is that the other piece that was being asked that I think got missed a little bit was asking people who work for a company, whether it's the government or any place else, what their political affiliations are, is illegal. And the fact that we keep having this conversation about trying to discern who's working for who and who has agendas because of their political affiliations is fundamentally problematic. It's the same question about asking, are you married? Same conversation about asking if you have children. So I want to make sure that part is discussed in terms of this before I go, because I think that has been a talking point that has happened in multiple ways, and even from government officials who know they can't ask anyone who works for them. They hire them what their political affiliations are. The assumption that that's acceptable, and it came up multiple times, just FYI, about who was working for which companies, coming from which job from whoever was president at the time. It's an absurd conversation. The second part of this is, I think that I want to make sure I pull back on, which is about what Section 230 needs to be about, which is what we're not talking about. This is what was said earlier, a push for interference, domestic interference, political domestic interference, active legal domestic interference into the election for next week. Okay, I want to make sure that people understand exactly what's happening here. This is not about a conservative bias. This is not about one version versus another in terms of content. Again, I've said over and over and over again, no one has the right to incite violence, and no one has the right to commit harm. No one has the right to hate speech. No one has the right to any of those things. I don't care if you're a politician, and I don't care how much money you have. So to try to debate that issue and flatten this as if there's as a left and right issue, when the people who we're talking about are inciting violence against other Americans, by the way, is a fundamental problem with this discussion, because we're not really having that discussion. We're sort of dancing around it in very different ways. So there have been a couple of senators who have spoke to that, and those things need to be lifted up, because that's really what's happening in this hearing. And I love the fact that there was a question asked about them coming back again. And Zuck basically said, well, can I bring my other experts? No, you come back again and be held accountable for what's happening on your platform. I don't care what your experts in whatever fields that you're talking about is i.e. your content moderators that you're basically blaming and not holding yourself accountable for your organization, your company, and the actions that your company has in interfering in our election and causing harm to Americans. Myanmar is one example. Using your platform to commit a genocide. We're having the same debate in conversations about what happened in Kenosha and other aspects of the platform being used to incite violence to harm Americans. They should be held accountable for that, and we should not be debating anything else.
Thank you, Shireen, and thank you. Shireen's been with me for about what 2.5, 3.5 hours.
2.5 hours.
I really appreciate well done. Thank you so much, Shireen. And
I gotta go, but
soon.
thank you for having me.
Thank you. Jim, we're just going to carry on unless we've got people on our team who will let us know if the questions are interesting and directed at Mark. So if you wanted to just pick up where Yael and Shireen left off, that'd be great.
Okay, that'd be fine. And I have to run about 10:50 Pacific Standard Time. But here's the thing. Basically, I agree with what Shireen just said. This hearing, particularly the Republican comments, and again, I run a very large nonpartisan organization. This is just a total charade, complete charade, political charade. John Tester's comment was completely correct about it. Having said that, we feel quite strongly at Common Sense that 230 has been a get out of jail free card for companies like Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg. And particularly in the context of the fact that the provision has been applied, has hurt kids on countless ways, and has also done a tremendous amount of damage to our democracy. Largely, and I agree with Gail about the amplification of disinformation, hate speech, racism, etc. And Facebook is by far the worst company involved. So Zuckerberg is up there spouting platitudes for the most part that we really don't agree with. And of course, we have held him accountable on that. This was also true in the privacy area, in addition to Section 230. I think that what we're going to see is a major overhaul of the rules in 2021. It completely depends on the outcome of the election, although as many as our audience may know, at Common Sense, we also run major legislation in the state of California, like we did with privacy, because it's a functioning democracy, unlike Washington, D.C. has been for the past few years. And one thing I'd say is I actually do believe that in general, treating platforms as publishers is not going to undermine the First Amendment. I am a professor at Stanford for 34 years. I teach civil rights and civil liberties, a huge believer in the First Amendment, and Common Sense's motto is sanity, not censorship. And by the way, we believe that an overhaul of Section 230 will benefit the companies themselves, including Facebook and Instagram, which have been the worst offenders. But publishers have flourished under the First Amendment, and they've been held accountable for the content on their platform. And there is a distinction, obviously, between user-generated content and content where people working for the publisher write it themselves. But there needs to be a vast overhaul of 230 in the context of kids and families, and also, I think, in the context of democracy. And this is going to be a very important discussion in 2021. And I think you're going to see it at the federal level in Washington, D.C., again, depending on the outcome of the election, because some of these senators are just creating sham arguments that are irrelevant to the bigger issue. And then second, I think, as we've proven at Common Sense in California, that there are ways to at least address some of the problems about content moderation and about regulation at the state level, particularly in California, where all the companies that are represented today are represented. And by the way, I've spoken directly with the three guys testifying there on multiple occasions about this: Sundar, Mark, and Jack Dorsey. And they've all handled it differently. And again, I think you watch Mark Zuckerberg, and he is, in many ways, he and Facebook have had their thumb on the scale for Donald Trump. I think they're very worried about antitrust. That's the other very big issue that's clearly front. That's coming, guys. You saw that Barr, right in October of an election year, filed a big antitrust a case against Google. And you're going to see, I'm quite confident, given our work behind the scenes, a Facebook effort as well. which will either come from state attorneys general or the Federal Trade Commission. So part of what's going on, particularly in Zuckerberg's case, is he's very worried about antitrust enforcement at Facebook and about the fact that Facebook could be required to divest itself of Instagram and WhatsApp. And I think, therefore, he has, more than the other two gentlemen on the stage, have played politics in this area and have, in many cases, bent over backwards to make, really, in this case, the Republicans and Donald Trump happy. And in that case, by amplifying false, hateful, and misinformation comments. So it's a very interesting political situation right now, which will hopefully be cleared up in post this election. And I do agree with Shireen that this is a hugely important election. And the idea that they're having this hearing 6 days before the outcome of the election day itself is completely a naked political move by Roger Wicker, Ron Johnson, etc. They're literally trying to interfere with the election. It's somewhat disheartening as a citizen to see it happen. And that said, I think to approach this on a nonpartisan basis in the same way we approach 230, privacy, and antitrust. These are hugely important issues. And Gael, what do you think?
I was just gonna say, you know, we've been talking about this hearing now for 3.5 hours, and my feeling is that we haven't learned a lot. We've had some really good observation discussion, and so, you know, I know, Jim, you have to go soon, and I know, Yael, you have that amazing puppy, which several people have just tweeted, can I see the puppy?
Sleeping. He's finally sleeping. We just have a slight delay. I'm listening to what Zuckerberg's saying right now. He just made this interesting comment, and by interesting, I mean BS comment. And he said something, I don't know what the question was. But the answer,
he's just going on now.
You know what, can we
get the live stream up?
As we talk about putting in place regulation or reforming Section 230 in terms of what we want to hold companies accountable for, I think that what we should be judging the companies on is how many people see harmful content before the companies act on it. And I think being able to act quickly and being able to act on content that is potentially going viral or going to be seen by more people.
That right there. Okay, first of all,
see a lot of people
we have no way to know that because there's zero transparency and zero insight into how many people see what. Whenever Facebook likes to brag, I'm going to unpack a few Facebook things, having worked there, a few Markisms I'm going to unpack here. So every time they make this comment about we take down 97%, first of all, 97% of what number? Second of all, that's 97% of what people flag to you. Like, we don't even know how much is on there to begin with. Like, all of these things sound so great. But when he says that a company should be judged for how many people see harmful content before it's acted on, okay, first of all, what are you going to put that number at? And second of all, sorry, I'm trying not to curse here. This gets me all worked up. So let me back up a step. Again, I'm sure you guys have already talked about this. I'm not going to give the whole attention economy speech. I mean, many people do and many people know it. But if your entire business model remains predicated on serving up people certain kind of content to keep them engaged, then first of all, you already are an arbiter of truth because you're already deciding what people do and do not see. And report after report has shown that the more salacious content, the more clickbaity content always wins. And your entire business model is predicated on that. So then taking the step back and saying, oh, but we should really just be responsible for how many people see harmful content before we take it down, has nothing to do with the actual question. The actual question is, in my opinion, should your platform be held accountable for the real world harms that are happening because of the way your platform was designed and the way it is monetized? And I'll give a real simple example. It's not a simple example, but it's an example we're never going to know the answer to. If you guys recall, during the Black Lives Matters protests, and now I'm going to mix up some of my details, so correct me if I'm remembering this one a little bit incorrectly. But there were two men who went to Oakland and killed a federal officer. And they killed a federal officer, they exploited the Black Lives Matter movement, and they went and they hatched out this plan, and they ended up being part of the Boogaloo Boys movement, this extreme right movement that basically is advocating civil war. Why do I give this example? To me, this is a fundamental Section 230 question. So you can debate first question, whether or not you think the Boogaloo Boys should even be allowed to say anything on Facebook whatsoever. Now, I know what I think. I think they're a hate group. I don't think they should be, but I can see both sides of that debate. If it is not being amplified, if it's just straight up people advocating what they believe in, that could be a free speech argument. Second question, what if you found out, though, that the two men, so by the way, they met in a Facebook group and they hatched out this plan in that group. What if you found out that those groups weren't even what they were looking for? It was recommended to these men. So does Facebook bear any responsibility for the fact that they recommended this Boogaloo Boys group to these two men who then met there and hatched out a plan to murder somebody via Facebook Messenger? I would say, yeah, probably. And the biggest point to this is this. If the spouse of that federal officer who was murdered wanted to take Facebook to court to find out, did your platform actually connect these two human beings? Did your platform recommend them into this hate group? They'll get thrown out on Section 230. They will never even get to discovery. They will never get to find out the answers to that question because it will be thrown out based on Section 230. And we are in the United States of America where we are supposed to have the right to recourse. We are supposed to be able to face our accusers. We are supposed to be able to seek justice. And the amount of things like, I want to know if Facebook tools in any way facilitated that murder. And even in that case, they'll never know. They're not required to tell us whether or not their recommendation engine connected those men or recommended the Boogaloo groups to them or facilitated any of this. That's just one of so many examples. But I'm just trying to get this human face to it. Like the spouse of that officer will never know because she'll never have her day in court against Facebook because of Section 230.
And
that's
can I just ask then?
Can I just follow up?
Oh yeah, go ahead, Jim. Go ahead, Jim. I'm gonna pose a final question to wrap up.
The dog is asleep now, so I can keep talking.
The way Section 230 has been interpreted is that's why it's a get out of jail free card. And by the way, I do actually think, remember, Facebook live streamed the massacre of 51 people at mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. So and that was to tens of millions of people. Yeah. So these are huge issues, and they need to be done in a really thoughtful, constructive manner that balances the best interests of society with the other concerns. The irony is that these companies are going to be better off with a well-regulated sense of platform accountability. I actually think they all know that. I think Sundar knows that. I think even Zuck knows that, and clearly Jack Dorsey knows that. And I just think right now we're not having a mature discussion. We are in this platform, but they aren't in the Senate. This is why this election is so important, because if there could be a much more healthy discussion in Washington and in Sacramento, given all the work we do there as well. But these are fundamental issues that go to the well-being of our society. And right now, as Yael says, this is a get out of jail free card for Zuckerberg and Facebook. And yes, I know we had earlier discussions about the attention economy and what Shoshana Zuboff and talks about as surveillance capitalism. It's all rolled into a much bigger narrative. But I'm so glad, Kyle, that we have a chance to have this discussion, because in a couple of months, we're going to have a very serious and hopefully very constructive debate and change a lot of this.
Yeah, and what perfect timing. The hearing's wrapping up. 4 senators apparently didn't attend. So this is my final question. Is Facebook too big to fix?
Yes. That's why we call them. That's why we call for the breakup. It is, but I would argue that the antitrust issues are really, really important because they go to many different issues. For example, they go to the simple bigness and the diminution of competition, right? But I'll give you an example from Stop Hate for Profit and the campaign that we've run over the past couple of months with the ADL, the NAACP, Color of Change, et cetera. So we launched Stop Hate for Profit and called for an advertiser boycott. 1,100 companies boycotted Facebook, right? And it blew them away. It was the most, and in some ways, the most successful action we've ever taken against them to hold them accountable. Here's what's interesting. What Zuckerberg said and what their head of ad sales said, Caroline, was they'll have to come back to us because there's no place else for them to go. So that argues on its face that they're too big, Kyle, because they're literally saying, because we're so big and we're the only game in town, advertisers have to come back to us. So yes, they are too big. And I actually think the antitrust case that will be brought, that I would strongly urge you to see will come out in very soon against Facebook, which I think will come from state AGs and potentially the Federal Trade Commission. And who knows if there's a change of administration, because the Trump administration has been so close to Facebook. But I think that will have a very salutary effect on these discussions. And the other antitrust cases, I think, will force some of these issues out as well. I think there's going to be an interplay between antitrust, Section 230, the privacy laws that we've written, and that should be done at the federal level. So I think we're going for a really interesting issue, but bigness matters. And bigness is a very big factor, not in the political charade of this hearing, but it will be when we have a constructive discussion about how we're going to regulate the tech economy.
So
thanks so much, Jim. And Yael, the last word is yours.
Yael,
I'm just going to, in addition to everything he just said, because the antitrust argument, I won't go into it right now. I agree. Listen, I'm going to give another, like when I was there, I was hired to start a new team to head their elections integrity operations. When we were getting ready for the US midterm elections, I specifically tried to put together a plan that revolved around not being able to lie about voting in ads, which basically means voter suppression. At the same time, we had this human rights audit going on, a civil rights audit going on within the company. Correct. Now, every single thing I tried, the first pushback I would get was, oh, but that won't scale to the whole world. And I've said, of course it won't scale to the whole world. Right now, I understand I am your global elections person, but right now I am talking about the US midterms. Every single election has its own unique situation, its own unique political realities, its own versions of disinformation and all of the different issues. And the idea that Facebook could scale to dominate the entire world, but now when we're talking about really important localized elections issues, hate speech issues, violence issues, it's, oh, no, well, that doesn't scale to the entire world, so we can't do that. Well, then you know what? You're way too big. Because if you cannot approve my plan, or at least consider my plan on how to protect the US midterm election at the time from voter suppression tactics because it doesn't scale to the entire world, then in and of itself, you just told me you are way too big. So that's just one very little example. I could give a million, but
it's a great
it's point. A perfect one. And
absolutely great point. And they have the same strategy: deny, deflect, distract. We are so tired of it. And Yael, it's so good when you or Sandy Parakilas and some of the other guys have left Facebook and come out. I think one of the most important things that's happened in the past couple of years is that folks like Yael have come out and said, I was inside the company. I saw this happen this way. We watched those decisions that Mark and Cheryl and Elliot and Nick Clegg are making, and they deny, deflect, distract. They know exactly what's going on. And the bigness issue, that's a great example of it, Yael. But we even saw it with the advertiser boycott. So that's why antitrust matters. It's why all of these issues are going to get wrapped up. And I'm optimistic that 2021 is going to be an incredibly important year, certainly for U.S. regulation. 2021, 2022 is going to transform the tech landscape, right, and from a regulatory and legislative standpoint, God willing, inshallah.
Let's hope that's true. First, we have to get through the election in 6 days. I want to thank Jim for joining, Yael, everyone else who's joined us for the last 3 hours and 49 minutes. Yael, go back to that lovely puppy, which is the antithesis. Well, now he's asleep, which is the antithesis of that Senate hearing. We really appreciate everyone joining us, and we hope you found this useful from the viewer perspective as well. Have a lovely evening, day, night, wherever you are. Take care.
Thank you for organizing the Real Facebook Advisory Board, because it's a really good idea, Kyle and Carol. We appreciate it.